My name is Don Linky. It is May 14, 2009. We're here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the campus of Rutgers University in New Brunswick. This is part of the series of video interviews that we've been conducting for the Brendan Byrne archive of the Rutgers program on the governor. Today we're going to be talking to Harold Martin. Harold was a leader in the New Jersey Assembly during the administration of Governor Brendan Byrne on education reform, chairing the Joint Committee on Reform of the Thorough and Efficient Education Program that has become a continuing issue not only from the 1970s but to the current day. Harold has been active in politics since the 1950s. He's also been very successful in the private sector, in business, and has been a leader in philanthropic causes in New Jersey, including the support of Rutgers University here in New Brunswick. We're going to be discussing the range of issues that Harold has seen over the course of his long political career in New Jersey, and to talk a little bit about how the state has changed for better or worse. And we'll be happy to talk to Harold about his perspective on current day government and politics. Harold, I wanted to first start with some thoughts that you have over your political career as to how politics in New Jersey and government in New Jersey has changed over your adult political life, both for better or for worse.
Well, Don, I hate to say it, but I think that the political atmosphere in New Jersey has gone downhill. I think there's pretty general agreement amongst those of us who have served in New Jersey politics, whether it be on the local, county, or state level, that tempers have gotten very short. And the give and take that used to be on a friendly basis has turned about 180 degrees. And that's a rather unpleasant situation, and I think that has to change before any real progress in solving the problems of our governments, whether it be local, county, or state. That's got to change. There has to be a friendly rapport amongst those of us who are in government.
Well, we'll discuss, I think, in more detail the relationships that you had in the 1970s and perhaps contrast to what is happening today in Trenton and perhaps also in Washington. But I'd like to get more of a personal sort of background before we move on to the political side. You were born in 1918 in West New York. Woodrow Wilson is still president of New Jersey. And then you moved to Brooklyn, or your family moved to Brooklyn when you were 6 years old, right?
That's correct.
I'd sort of like to probe your mind as to what were your early childhood memories growing up. I suspect that Brooklyn was the first thing that you can recall rather than the West New York days, but why don't you tell the story?
Well, that's not quite true, Don. I guess I've been blessed with a very long memory, and I did have a rather interesting childhood. And just very briefly, let me tell you that my parents operated a menswear store in West New York on the very, very best corner for business that ever existed. It used to be known as 16th Street, and then sometime many years later they renumbered the streets in Hudson County, I guess, at least in West New York, and it is now known as 60th Street, Bergen Line Avenue. As a matter of fact, I probably was born only a few blocks from where one of my colleagues in the legislature, whom you may recall, Joe LaFonte, not Joe LaFonte, but Chris Jackman. I meant to say Chris Jackman. That's a problem that you get with old age. But at any rate, my parents had a store there, which was a rather good-sized store, and we did a big business. And from my earliest days, when I was only a tot, maybe 2 years old or so, since both parents were busy in the store, as were my older brother and older sister, in the evenings, instead of taking me up and putting me to bed, because there'd be nobody up there to watch me, we lived right above the store, they would put me into a carton, which was filled with soft paper, the stuff that you take out of shirt boxes or short boxes or whatever, basically tissue paper, and that was my bed. And of course, when the store closed, they would take me up and put me in my regular bed. And so when I became old enough, even at the age of maybe 5 years old, I was aware that we were selling merchandise. And I guess that stayed with me all my life. I basically have a salesman's approach to activity in terms of socializing. I'm not afraid to meet people and so forth. But then at the age of 6, maybe a little bit before that, my folks gave up the store. They lost the lease on the building, and we eventually had to relocate to Brooklyn. But in between, my parents took an extended trip to Europe. That was 1924. And I had the good fortune to meet the Queen, whom you probably may not remember, because before your time, Queen Mary, the wife of King George V. And it happened at a fair. The British are always having fairs. I said fairs, not affairs, although they have those too. At any rate, for some reason or other, she was there, and she patted me on the head, so my parents told me, and I remember that. And then, at the age of 6, as you said, we moved to Brooklyn, where they opened another men's store, and I was one of their prime salesmen at the age of 13 or 14 or whatever, and in between going to school.
How did the families of your parents first come to this country?
Well, my father was born on the Lower East Side, and I'm told that since his parents had very little money and they were immigrants themselves, the family always moved about once a month to avoid paying rent. And that was an unfortunate situation, but one that many, many families experienced at that period. My mother was born in Romania, and since I was so young at the time, hearing stories about her childhood, it meant really very little to me. And unfortunately, she died at a fairly, what might be considered a young age today. I know very little about her parents or her family.
And on your father's side, what country was the country of origin?
My father's side, his father came from an area that was in contention over the years, many years, between Russia and Poland. Whether he was Polish or Russian, I really don't know. But I do know from hearsay that he came to this country to avoid serving in the Russian army. And that was a common thing for many, many Jewish people.
Mm-hmm. Well, talk a little bit about the Brooklyn of these early years
Yes,
in your childhood.
Sure. My earliest recollection, I guess it was 1927, and I was then 9 years old. I recall very distinctly a parade that took place. We were on a busy thoroughfare, 86th Street, Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, which is a very busy commercial area. And of course, in those days, there were very few automobiles. So it was almost like some of our suburban towns here, the smaller suburban towns. And I remember very distinctly standing out on the street in the gutter, waiting for Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh, to come by in a limousine, sitting up on the rear of the open car. And I was within, I guess, the distance from here to the table, or to you, to Charles Lindbergh. And that was a very vivid experience. And I really started in school in Brooklyn. I was only, 19, we moved there in 1925, so I was 7 years old. But apparently my teachers thought so well of me that I skipped twice in elementary school. And so I graduated high school when I was only 17 instead of 18.
Did your parents sort of stress education as the way up?
No, my parents, neither of them. My father had no more than a grade school education. He happened to be quite talented as a haberdasher. And my mother had no more than a grade school education. And of course she had to learn English when she came here. And their waking hours, which were from early morn to about 12 o'clock at night, were taken to making a living operating the store. So that neither one of them talked in terms of education. But I do know that they were delighted, absolutely ecstatic, if I can use that term, when they learned that I was skipping a couple of classes in school.
And was the business successful enough at that time that you thought of going on to college?
Oh, yes, yes. We had a very, very good business. We had no competition. And we had a lot of, don't forget, this was a couple of years before the crash. We had a lot of Wall Street traders and brokers and executives who lived in Bay Ridge, because that was considered a very desirable place for people in Wall Street to live. And so we did a very big business. And we had some very important people, mainly ship captains. We had a lot of Norwegian, Swedish, Irish ship captains who, when they came off the ship, wanted clothing, and they were our customers.
Was the ethnic mix of the neighborhood mostly Eastern European, mostly Jewish, or more mixed?
Oh, no, it wasn't Jewish by any means, because I encountered some anti-Semitism, not on a big scale, minor, but irritating, and, it was principally Norwegian and Swedish, then Irish, German, and Italian. And the tradespeople, the people in commerce, some of them were Jews. Mm-hmm. But we had a nice mix. People were, by and large, very friendly, very welcoming, and it was a nice place to live. Mm. And Coney Island was only about 3 or 4 miles away. So I used to ride my bicycle on occasion to Coney Island to get a Nathan's hot dog, and maybe get a ride on the Dodgem cars or the Ferris wheel, or to go swimming.
Now you mentioned seeing Lindbergh. Did he become a hero, or was it just a casual sort of
that's a good question.
contact?
Now you raise a very good question. At that time, he was my hero. When I was in college and I saw him making eyes at Hitler, that changed my impression of him. And I took him for what he was pro-Nazi.
And what, in this sort of turbulent time, moving into the 1920s and 30s, politically, did you have heroes, or did you think even about politics at that time?
As I search back, because it's quite a few years now, I used to do a lot of reading from my earliest days when business was slow, when I wasn't needed to put stock away or to stock the shelves. I would sit in the back of a store and read the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which no longer exists, as you know, the World Telegram, which later became World Telegram and Sun, and I would read voraciously. There was a murder case in New Jersey. Charles Lindbergh's son was murdered, and I read that voraciously and followed the trial, etc. And but in terms of politics, I don't believe that I really got interested until there was a governor, Alfred E. Smith, was governor of New York State. And somehow or other he captured my imagination because of his very humble beginnings as a newspaper deliverer. And I thought it was remarkable that anybody who started out as a paper boy, so to speak, could rise up through the ranks and get the support of Tammany Hall. And I began to read about Tammany Hall, and I thought that any man who could face up to Tammany Hall and be governor in his own right was a rather interesting person to sort of set up as an idol. And so I became quite interested. And as luck would have it, my sister, who became one of the first lawyers to pass the bar, the first students to pass the law bar, she went to New Jersey Law School, which is now Rutgers. I think she might have even been, I don't know, she doesn't know, she might have even been Dick Hughes or Governor Hughes's classmate, but I'm not sure of that. At any rate, she went to work for Al Smith, Jr. as a clerk in his law firm. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting, juxtaposition.
Any other siblings?
Yes, my brother is 5 years older than me, and he's a graduate engineer, graduated at the University of Missouri in 1935, and 34, excuse me. And since I went out with my father and mother to pick him up at the end of the school year, I fell in love with the University of Missouri, which isn't hard to do. Beautiful campus. And since I had no other ideas as to where I wanted to go to college, I just followed in his footsteps. And my sister is 10 years older than I am. She's just turned 96. Excuse me, my brother has turned 96. My sister has turned 101.
Good genetic pool.
So longevity runs in the family.
Okay. Well, I want to move back a little bit to Brooklyn again before
Sure.
we go
Sure.
to college. What other memories? How about the Dodgers and Ebbets Field?
Oh, yes, yes. Glad you raised that. When I read the newspapers, as I told you before, I was inclined to try to guess, by doing a little math, of course, what the batting averages were going to be tomorrow if so-and-so, Pee Wee Reese or Hack, I forgot his first name, Stan Hack, who later became a Cub, or the Wainer boys, Paul and I forgot his brother's name.
Snuffy or?
I don't recall.
Anyway, yeah.
At any rate, the Wainer brothers. I try to figure out what either the batting averages or their earned run averages were, just by, long division. It was one of my quirks.
Well, you later showed interest in economics. Did you always have this sort of number crunching?
Yeah, I guess so. I was
fascination?
always geared to trying to figure out whether a stock was a good buy or not. I did that when I was, 14, 15, 16 years old. I didn't wind up buying any stock until I graduated. So it was September 1st of 1939 when Hitler moved across the border. I said, this is a good time to buy some stock. So I bought some Bethlehem Steel, not much, just a few shares. And I bought some Curtiss Wright aircraft. And I bought Cuban American Sugar. And I made some money on all three of them. But that was only like 12 years later. Yeah.
Now, at Missouri, what courses do you remember? Any particular professors?
I took the usual, I took English, composition, I guess it was. I took the beginner's course in botany or biology. Yeah, botany and biology, I guess. At any rate, I took French. I had already had 4 years of French in high school, and I'd had 4 years of Spanish in high school.
That's New Utrecht High School.
New Utrecht, yes, which is Dutch name, and of course Brooklyn was pretty much founded by the Dutch. And I graduated not at the top of my class in high school, but I guess I was a B-plus student. At any rate, I had a good education in New Utrecht. It was a school of 5,000 students in 3 buildings. There was a beginner's building, which you went to for 1 year, another building which you went to for another year, and then you went to the main building for 2 years. And they had some very good teachers, and I was a good student. And when I was in college, you asked me about Missouri. I took English, French, advanced French, and biology, botany, and a course in political science. And the teacher in political science, professor in political science, had aspirations to be a politician. And I understand, not while I was there, but a few years after I left, he ran for Congress. Now, whether he made it or not, I really can't say. But he inspired me to follow the political line. And I finished my year at Missouri. Toward the end of the year, a lot of students got the flu, and I was no exception. So when I came home, the doctor advised me to find a drier climate than the Missouri Valley, which, as you know, is quite damp, rainy. So I had to find another school. And I looked at schools ranging from New Mexico, Oregon, Arizona, California, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, basically looking at temperatures and climates. And I decided if I'm going to find a dry climate, nothing like Arizona. So I applied there and was accepted. And just as a sidelight, when my father knew I was going to go to Arizona, he said, you know, there's a good deal I saw in the newspaper. He used to read the Herald Tribune. And on the inside page of the first page, there was a little column, and it had specials, sort of. There was, for $85, you could take a ship, a cruise, from New York to Galveston, Texas. And from Galveston, you would take a electrified trolley up not to Houston, from Corpus Christi up to Galveston, and there you would take the Southern Pacific Rail line to Arizona, all for $85. Well, those were Depression days, and so I took it. It was the most wonderful experience of my life.
Had you ever been to Arizona before
No,
enrolling
no.
at the University of
None
Arizona?
of my family had been there. I just got up and went.
And what was Tucson like in those days? Probably a wild and woolly place.
That's a very good description. When I got off the train in Tucson, I thought I was in heaven. I was used to big buildings in New York. Here there were no big buildings. You were lucky if you saw a two-story building. And the two-story buildings were down in the center of town, which was only a few blocks from the rail station. I looked around, I saw 4 mountains around the town. It's ringed by 4 ranges. And I thought I had reached heaven.
How about adjusting to the heat and to the new sort of environment? It's very different from a Brooklyn boy.
Yeah, except, Don, you must realize that I went there at the beginning of September. I guess it was late August. And yes, it was hot. When I got off the train, yes, it was pretty darn hot. But the humidity in those days, it's different now, because now they grow grass. But when I got off the train, there was nothing but sand and cactus. And it was very dry. And you didn't feel the heat the way you do here in the East. And then, of course, the winter was rather mild, except for the first snowstorm that some of my student friends from Arizona had seen, because it was the first time it snowed in 25 years in January of '36.
Well, as you get to start college in Tucson, University of Arizona, you also get a job in your old sort of family business of men's clothing, right?
Yes, that's correct. It was a small department store. I guess it probably had no more than maybe, if I had to judge, maybe 1,400 square feet. And small compared to what we have up here these days. But it was a 2-story building, and the boss, who was Mexican of Mexican heritage, Alex Jacome, spelled Jacome. He was a Harvard graduate, and when I told him my parents had operated a menswear store, he hired me on the spot because Christmas season makes up a great deal of the revenue for any retail shop. And he put me into the menswear department. This was over the Christmas holidays. And I had a rather interesting experience you might be interested in hearing. It was, I guess, sort of late afternoon, maybe 3:30, 4 o'clock or thereabouts. And I was busy taking care of a customer, waiting on a customer. And I had to get some shirts off the shelf that were in a box, because what was in the showcase apparently didn't meet the customer's needs. And as I whipped around, I was only maybe not quite 18 at the time. I was energetic, and I whipped around with the box, and I bumped into a gentleman who apparently had a couple of canes. I knocked him down. Well, I was beside myself. And the boss saw this. Mr. Hakame came running down off the balcony, and he helped the gentleman up as I did. And I didn't know who it was. And he apologized to the gentleman, and I apologized to him. Apparently he wasn't hurt, just shaken up. Well, to make a long story short, after he left the store, maybe a half hour later, the boss came over to me and he said, "Do you know who that was?" I said, "I have no idea." He said, "That was John Blackjack Pershing, the general who commanded the American forces in Europe." Well, I almost fell off my feet because he was one of my heroes.
Of course, he'd also had a New Jersey connection too, didn't he?
I'm sorry?
He also had a New Jersey connection.
Yes, with the military, you're right. We moved into, as you know, I served in the World War II. And after we were married, Reba and I were married, we moved into a small town in Bergen County, Cresskill. It's only 1 square mile. And in it used to be a camp. It was Camp Merritt in World War II. It was basically a staging area before men were sent overseas or when they returned as a point of debarkation. And as luck would have it, after I became freeholder, well, that's another story, but I just want to mention it here. It was my job, since Cresskill was my town, the Board of Freeholders decided that I would be the one to make the Memorial Day speech at the monument. We have a monument right between the town of Dumont and the town of Cresskill. But the Camp Merritt covered both towns, or the major part of both towns. And the gentleman who was in charge of that camp during part of his Army career was none other than John J. Pershing. And
Who you had knocked over in Tucson.
Yeah, he's the guy that I knocked down in Tucson, Arizona. And his picture, in case you're interested, in case you want to take a photograph of it, you can have your photographer go up and take a still picture of John J. Pershing in his military uniform. It hangs on the left wall as you go into the council chambers. And you can see it there.
Okay. Any other memories of Arizona?
Oh, yeah, sure. Memories. Where else would a New York boy or New Jersey boy get to ride horses out on the desert amongst the cactus And where else would would a New York boy learn to jump a horse about that high, which is about what, 3 feet, 3.5 feet?
Mm-hmm.
If you've never done that, I suggest you have your heart checked first to make sure it'll withstand the thrill.
Now, you graduate from the University of Arizona.
Yes. No. I didn't graduate from Arizona. I spent my sophomore year there.
Oh, that's right. And then you come
I
east
came home,
back.
Came home east, came back east at the end of the school year, had an operation on my nose, and after the operation I got a very serious strep infection that went from my nose into my ears. And it almost killed me. I was in bed for, more than a month, maybe 6 weeks or thereabouts. And I had to learn to walk all over again, because that was in the days, as you know, before the wonder drugs. So I ran 106 fever for, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 days or whatever. And just by luck, the pus in the ear broke through the canal. It was what is known as a natural operation, so to speak. They used to cut, in order to relieve that kind of a situation, they used to cut into your mastoid. But it was either breakthrough or I was through. I would have died.
So you apply after your health, I guess, is restored somewhat to other universities, including Rutgers.
Yeah, I applied to maybe, I don't recall how many, but it was around 10, I guess. I don't know. Because in those days, it didn't cost you anything to apply to a college. And incidentally, I might mention, might be of interest to you, when I went to the University of Missouri, it cost me $125. $100 out-of-state fee and $25 tuition. It wasn't really tuition. It was for athletic facilities usage. And the same thing was true of the University of Arizona. So my only expenses were living expenses, which were very cheap in those days. I guess they ran to $35, $40 a month. Room and board. Room and board. Of course, if you don't mind eating chili con carne 6 days a week, you know. But you asked me the question. I applied to University of Maine. I applied to University of Wisconsin. I applied to University of Illinois in Urbana. I applied to Penn State, and I applied to Princeton. Princeton accepted me, which was unusual.
Unusual?
Because
why?
Well, it was unusual for one reason, that they didn't take too many Jewish students, if any. But I may have fooled them, because on the application where it said religion, I just left it blank. And they may not have known. But I went down to Princeton and I toured the campus, and when I saw the eating club and saw who the students who were eating there, I said, this is out of my class. And I decided I'd go to Rutgers. So I enrolled here.
And what was Rutgers like in those days?
It's a good question. In the first place, the only thing that I knew of Rutgers in those days was the campus that existed from Queens, the Queens campus, all the way up to River Road, near where the John Lynch Bridge is, College Avenue, both sides of College Avenue. And as a matter of fact, I lived on Richardson Street. I rented a room in a rooming house, number 6 Richardson Street. I'll never forget that. There were 3 other students who also rented rooms there. And all I knew of Rutgers was from number 6 Richardson Street to the new gymnasium. It was new in those days. As a matter of fact, it had just been built, which was just a block from where I lived. And of course, Bishop Campus and Queens, the old Queens campus. And Winans Hall was where we bought our books. And incidentally, Winans Hall was nothing like what you know it. This is a new brick building. In my day, it was a fire trap. It was a wooden, rickety, when you walked up the steps, you were not sure whether the steps would hold you. They creaked. It was a real fire trap, and everybody knew it, but they couldn't close it down. They needed it.
Any particular courses or professors that you really took a liking to?
Oh, yeah, sure. You're raising a good question. You know, I have a basis for comparison because I went to the U of M and the U of A, right? And so I had good professors at both places. The U of A, Arizona, had professors who, like me, went out there for health reasons, for climate reasons. And a lot of those professors came from University of Michigan, University of Illinois, University of Chicago. They were good professors, real good. So I had no qualms about that. And U of M, University of Missouri, they were pretty good, but nothing to write home about. But at Rutgers, they were superb because a lot of the professors had to moonlight in order to survive. Professors didn't make very much in those days. They might have gotten $2,500, $2,800, maybe even $3,000, and that wasn't much to live on. Especially if you had, as one of my professors had a child who had severe disabilities. And it was a real problem for him. And he was one of my best professors. Mm-hmm. And his name was Burns. He taught international law. Real good. I had John J. George, who I understand ran for Congress after I left in 1941, somewhere around 43 or 44, I don't know when it was. He ran for Congress. I don't know whether he made it or not, didn't make it. At any rate, he was real good too. He taught constitutional law. And I had another professor by the name of Burns, who was absolutely superb. He taught history, European history from 1815 to current. And he was marvelous. No notes. He had the notes, but he had them behind his back. 3x5 cards. I think in all the time I saw him, I think maybe he looked at them 3 times, 4 times. Had a fantastic memory. Really fantastic. But the outstanding, and then I had Professor Gideonce, whose brother was the president of Brooklyn College. Mm-hmm. Harry Gideonce was the president of Brooklyn College in the late 40s, early 50s. Do
you remember how you spell that?
Gideonce.
Okay.
Gideonce, Dutch name. And both of them, I think, were refugees. Max Gideonce, my professor in international economics, very good man. But the outstanding one was Arthur Burns, who became the chairman of the Federal Reserve System. Arthur was a refugee from Austria and a very unique individual. Jet black hair, combed back, and he used to have a pipe. And our classroom was no bigger than this room, no bigger than this room. The blackboard was here. He propped his chair up. He used to do this and lean up against the blackboard, and there were times when it was touch and go as to whether he would
fall over,
slip. Yeah. And he would take his pipe and take the reamer and ream and ream and ream and think about what some of the great economists had to say on page 652 in their book, and look up at the ceiling as though the words were up there. At any rate, he would then proceed to fill his pipe and tamp it down for another 10 minutes. And then, in those days, you could smoke. He lit up his pipe, and he'd stink us out of the room. I mean, it's terrible. All the time giving us his version of Marshall's Principles of Economics, or John Maynard Keynes, or some of the other, Burke or whatever, who knows.
Of course, you'd later work at the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
Was that the first time you sort of got an interest in what they did?
Yeah, because he opened my eyes as to how the economic and financial system worked in this country. Oh, I had one other professor, too, two others who should be mentioned. Dr. Agar, Eugene Agar, a slight, portly sort of gentleman with blondish white hair, who used to use a green shade, not a complete hat, but just a shade, eye shade, and he would sit in his office next to Ford Hall. There's a building, I presume it's still there, a two-story or three-story building, and he was chairman of the Department of Economics in those days. Man about maybe 60-ish or so. Somehow or other, he and I, our chemistry gelled, and he would wait for me. He taught a class right after lunch at 1 o'clock, and I would come out of the dorm, Ford Hall. I had moved onto the campus in my senior year, and I would pick him up, and we'd walk over to class, and he would talk about all sorts of things. And incidentally, his son-in-law, just as a sidelight, his daughter, Carol, I think was her name, she married a guy who became a Supreme Court justice, and that was Abe Fortas, whom Johnson appointed to the court. And there was one other professor that I should mention, a small man who taught at Columbia, as did Arthur Burns. Both of them moonlighted. They moonlighted at Rutgers. They taught at Columbia. And at any rate, the professor that I'm about to tell you, and I'm searching my memory for his name. At the moment, I'm having a senior moment. But at any rate, he had polio. He had terrible time walking. but he was real good. I learned finance. He was the professor of finance, and he went into the Federal Reserve operations at greater length. And of course that got me interested too. But my getting into the Federal Reserve Bank of New York had nothing other than being on my resume, because that didn't occur until after I got out of the Army.
Well, let's talk about that. You're in college during World War II, at least the beginning, and then you go into the Army. What was the sort of atmosphere at Rutgers before you go into the Army?
Oh, yeah. It was a very leisurely place, very friendly place. It was all male, as you know. The co-eds didn't start coming in until after I left, unfortunately. But of course there were plenty of co-eds over on Douglas campus. And it's only 1.25 miles or so to walk. We didn't have cars in those days. We walked. At any rate, it was a very leisurely place. But as it became evident that there was going to be a war, I'm talking now in terms of 1938, we spent a good deal of time, or at least I did, in the evenings with the radio going, listening to Edward R. Murrow, Charles Collingwood, Shira, and others, discussing the approach of what was coming in 39 and 40, you know. And so there was that apprehension. And I must mention one other thing. You asked me about the school. Rutgers in those days didn't have much of a football team. Our big games were Princeton and Brown and Penn State and maybe Temple. At any rate, I saw the games on a field, just a field with some stands that were where the big red building on Bishop campuses, the one that they use for dining hall and banquets or whatever, that was a football field. And then at the end of 38, they moved across the river to the stadium, where I had the pleasure of seeing Rutgers defeat Princeton for the first time in I don't know how many years. And of course the town, and the Rutgers students went wild. They marched through town, just went wild. But I must mention, there was something else on my mind that I wanted to tell you. Yes, we had a great, and I can't emphasize enough, debating program. I can't remember the name of the professor, but he was a student of debating. He was a public relations type of guy. And he sent us out. He arranged, it was quite a chore, he arranged for 5 teams. I think there were 5 teams of 4 students each to go on a tour at spring break. And so I and 3 other students, one of whom owned a car. His father was the athletic director here. I think his last name was Talbot, but I'm not sure. At any rate, the 4 of us started out. We went out to Lehigh and Lehigh and Lafayette, debated them. Then we went down to Temple, debated them. And in each case, wherever we went, the host team provided us with lodging and food, and maybe even entertainment.
What sparked your interest in debate?
I'm sorry?
What sparked your interest in debate?
Well, it was part of the public speaking class.
So it was almost required.
Yeah, it was, it was an extension. Not everybody who was in public speaking went on the tours. I was fortunate, and it was quite an experience. We went to Maryland, debated U of M. We went down to Georgetown. We went out to West Virginia. We went through Pennsylvania, Susquehanna, I think we debated. We went out as far as Cincinnati, debated University of Cincinnati, and then we went up to Cleveland, and then we returned to New Jersey. So inside of a week, we covered a lot of territory, and it was a marvelous experience. And the interesting thing, Don, is that in some cases, our opponents could not believe. They couldn't believe that we knew so much about the subject. And the basic question at that point was, shall the United States help Great Britain and France by supplying them with arms? In some cases, we took the positive. In some cases, we took the negative. It was a flip of the coin. And we had to be prepared at a moment's notice to take either side. And we were complimented. A couple of places, the professor who was in charge of his students, in one case he came over to me and he says, Harold, he says, where did you learn to do this? He just couldn't believe, So all it indicated was that we had something that they didn't have.
Which side of the question did you personally, outside your debate role, fall under?
Oh, obviously, I was for the. I say obviously, you may not know it, so it may not be that obvious, but I was on the for pro side, and principally because my professors were pro, and the arguments were overwhelming that we either had to stop that madman, Hitler, I should say men, and Mussolini. You didn't hear too much about Japan. That didn't come until later on. But it was obvious that there was a couple of madmen, and they had to be stopped. And let me, while I'm on it, if I may, in those days, I don't know whether they do it today, but we had what is known as a convocation, where a prominent speaker on a national level would be invited to speak. We had two very prominent ones, Wendell Willkie, the chairman of Commonwealth and Southern Utility, who ran for president on the Republican ticket, but he was being challenged at that time by Senator Robert Taft, the son of President Howard Taft. And both of them came to the campus. Willkie spoke in the what was then the new gym, and he had, I don't know, maybe all of the classes. We might have had 1,400 students in the auditorium, in the gym. When Taft came, they had him speak in Kirkpatrick Chapel, which is small, as you know. And I think it was only our senior class that attended. You were required to come. And Taft made the anti-argument, stay out of it. It's none of our business. Let them fight it out, and we'll be stronger when it's all over, and all that. Well, that bothered me, and I got up at the end of his talk, and I challenged his thesis. And with all due respect, Senator Taft, I disagree with you on this, that, and the other basis, and I'd like to get your answer to my thesis. And I was the only one that got up and challenged him.
At this point, had President Roosevelt become a political hero of yours?
Only to some extent. I was totally in agreement, because I saw the evidence of it, with his program to rejuvenate the economy. He had WPA, he had TVA, he had PWA, he had any number of other programs. And I was a recipient. When I went to the University of Arizona, if it had not been for PWA, they wouldn't have had 6 or 7 new buildings that I was privileged to use. All they had before that was Old Main, which was a building that went back to the 1860s or 70s or whatever, and a few other old brick buildings, that's all. So his program really put U of A on the map. And I had to agree with with what he was doing. As far as his international program is concerned, one of my professors, the name I couldn't think of before, Sundelson, Wilner Sundelson. He was a polio victim, a very bright guy, very bright, and good teacher. And he asked me, would I mind lending my name to a committee to try to get the president to supply arms to Britain and France. I forget what he called it, the committee to help our allies by supplying Lend-Lease, that's right. And so I said yes, and I don't know, a couple of stories were written up in the New Brunswick Home News, but that's about it.
Well, in 1943, you leave college and enlist in the Army, is that correct?
I didn't leave, I went to work in 41. I left here in 41, not completing my thesis. I had all my coursework done for my master's, but in 41, when I finished, I took some exams, federal exams, for jobs. And I had an offer from I forget what department, Interior Department, one of the departments, is for a clerk. And they offered me $1,400 or something like that. And I said, this is ridiculous. I can't go to live in Washington, for $1,400. It's ridiculous. Well, my brother was working up in a war plant in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And he says, look, you don't have a job yet. Come up for the summer. Cape Cod is nice for the summer. Come up here, work. When you find something, that you like, just take it. So I went up there, and I was working only about a month or so. I think it was July. I saw an ad in the newspaper for a sailboat, and it sounded interesting, and I liked the idea of sailing. I'd never sailed, and I couldn't swim worth a darn, but I had an idea I'd like to learn. So at any rate, I answered the ad. It was a young man, a college student, an engineering student from Lehigh University, whose father happened to be the commander of the fort in New Bedford, Fort Rodman. He had this brand new boat that he built with, I guess, government money. He had all the best materials. It was about an 18-foot sailboat, not a class boat, just an ordinary. You'd think of it as a a rowboat, a large rowboat with a keel, a steel keel on it. But it looked beautiful. He had just painted it, and it was gorgeous. And it had 165 square feet of Pima cotton sail. I said, how much do you want for it? He said, how about $150? I took out a deposit of $25, and I said, write out a bill of sale for me, and I'll pick the boat up Saturday when I am not working. Sure enough, my brother and I went back Saturday. He put the boat in the water, and inside of about an hour, he showed us both how to hold a tiller and sail the boat. And that's how I learned to sail. The only problem was it had no motor on it. And as you know, when you get becalmed, you could sit there and fry. There's a tale to this story that you may be interested in. Somewhere, maybe a couple of months later, I saw an ad for an outboard motor. And I said to my brother, that's what we need. We need a motor for the boat in case we're becalmed. So we went and looked at the motor. There's a 75 horsepower outboard. I forget the name of it, but at any rate, I bought it. I don't know, $30 or whatever. And we cleaned it up, put it on the boat, but we never could get the thing to run. Apparently, the previous owner, I guess, didn't tell us that he had dropped it in the salt water, because that's the only thing I can think of as to why it wouldn't work. We put a new spark plug in. It just would not kick over. And if you ever tried to start an outboard motor, you could break your arm. At any rate, we never used the motor. Never used the motor. And then right after that, in early 43, February or March, I was offered a job as a reporter on the New Bedford, I forget the name of the paper, but New Bedford paper. But they offered me, I don't know, $30 a week or something like that. I said, no, not for me. I quit my job because even though I was making overtime, incidentally, I started that job in 41 for the minimum wage, 25 cents an hour, counting rivets and paper tubes, which are used in making condensers, capacitors, for the electronics equipment used in World War II. And as luck would have it, I finally wound up making 40 cents an hour and doing overtime. And so my biggest check, I think, might have been $65 a week or something like that. So I quit. I quit the job. I had a good deferment. I really didn't have to quit. But I wanted to get into the service. So I quit, and I was drafted in April of 43. And just as I was drafted, I had taken an exam in the intervening period for the State Department. They offered me a job, but I was already summoned to report for duty.
Given your prior health problems, did you have any issues about getting into the Army, or did they take?
Yeah, I had my eyesight is I'm short, nearsighted, so that I couldn't get into the Air Force. I wanted to get into the Navy, but they rejected me on eyes. And of course, the Army drafted me, so I went into the service.
And of course, the story you just told about the outboard motor has some relevance to your military career, doesn't it?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. You know, having served in the Army, I know how they operate, and they have what is known as a MOS, Military Occupational Specialty. In those days, it was a card. Of course, nowadays with computers, things are different. But in those days, when you were drafted, a corporal or a sergeant would interview you and fill out this big tan card, big card. He asked me a whole host of questions: education, my interests, etc., 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 health questions, all that. Came the point where he asked me what my hobbies were. I told him fishing, sailing, and I don't know what else. And he put it down. And he said, did you have a motor on the boat? I said, yes. He never asked me whether I operated the motor. Well, a couple of days later, after we got all our shots and our equipment, all of that stuff, I'm on a train with the curtains drawn because of wartime secrecy problems, and I don't know where I'm headed. And the next day, the curtains go up, it's broad daylight, and where am I? I'm back up in Massachusetts, only about a half an hour from where I've been living. And get off the train, and they put us on a bus. Well, they fed us first, put us on the bus, and they take us to Camp Edwards, Massachusetts. And my title was motorboat operator in the Amphibian Engineers 4th Special Brigade.
Where it should have been sailing boat operator.
Yeah. Now, I don't know how much you know about the amphibian engineers, but their job is to bring the troops and supplies onto hostile beaches. And that's what I was trained to do. Believe it or not. Believe it or not.
And notably, obviously, the D-Day landing is probably the most prominent example.
Well, as we were being trained, the colonel in charge of the brigade kept telling us, men, it will not be many moons before you have to use the skills that we're teaching you. So you better damn well learn what we're showing you here. Well, somehow they decided they needed somebody to tell the troops why they're fighting. Because a lot of the people that were being drafted at that point were young fellows, 18, 19, 20 years of age. Don't forget, at that point in 43, I was 25. I was considered an old man, believe it or not. And so they wanted to teach the men why they're fighting. And there was a program that had just been started called the Why We Fight series. And it was being made in Long Island City in a filming studio. And in the Army, my MOS, Military Occupational Specialty, showed that I had had a lot of history and political science and languages. And so my card was one of 3 cards that were on the desk of this lieutenant in personnel. And he called me in, and he said, Martin, Private Martin, he says, I've got your card here on the top. He said, I want to interview you. He asked me a whole host of questions. He said, you've got the job. I'm not even going to interview the others. I went back they put me into headquarters. Don't forget, up until that point, I was a dog face, a grunt, just a private. The only higher officer I had seen in terms of day-to-day activity, was a corporal or a sergeant. They switched me to headquarters, and the next thing I knew, the colonel calls me into his office, and I'm sitting there like I'm sitting with you. And he said, Private Martin, he says, I see here you all went to the University of Missouri. When he said Missouri, I knew that he was a Missourian. Sure enough, he graduated from the University of Missouri a few years before me. And he put me at my ease, and he says, look, he says, I'm giving you an assignment. I'm giving you a weekend pass and 3 additional days. I want you to come back here at the end of your pass, prepared to tell the troops why they're fighting. And that's what I did. I went to the New York Public Library when I got home. I wrote up a story as to why we were in this war, or going to be in the war. And we put it up on a huge board, 24 foot wide by about, well, as high as the ceiling, with maps of all the continents, with lights, London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, Rome, etc., etc., etc. And as my writings were broken down into parts, roles, there were 3 or 4 of us who read different segments, and we were trying to tell the troops why they were. There was only one problem. In basic training, they run you ragged, and so at 10 o'clock or 10:30 or 11 in the morning, when you're there assembled to hear why you're fighting, they're drifting off to sleep.
Now, why don't we just continue with your rest of your Army career.
All right.
Coming out.
Yeah.
You eventually become second lieutenant, right?
Right.
And what were your other sort of experiences? You went to officers candidate school.
Yes, yes. What happened, Don, along about late September, early October, they were getting ready to ship us overseas from Camp Edwards. Since I had been transferred out of basic training, I had already learned to operate LCPs, LCPRs, LSTs, LCMs, the bigger ships, you know, the ones that carry tanks, the ones that carry trucks, and all of that sort of thing. They had moved me into headquarters, so I was no longer doing boat duty. And it was late September, early October, they put me into cadre. Cadre is training personnel. And they shipped me down to Florida as cadre to train new troops to do boats duty. But when I got down to Florida, the lieutenant that was my superior said, Harold Martin, he says, you're going to OCS. And so he wrote up a recommendation for me, and it was accepted, and I was sent to New Orleans Army Air Base, which had a unit of the Transportation Corps, which was really what I was basically in. Transportation, moving troops and supplies. And so I went through OCS there, and of course they give you a broad training. It applies, you know, all over. But when I finished OCS, 4 of us were called out of line when we were given our commissions. And the 4 of us had the same things in common: multiple languages, history background, political science background, international relations background. And so they sent us to counterintelligence school up at Baltimore, Maryland. And so I went through the counterintelligence course, became a counterintelligence officer, second lieutenant, and that's it.
I wanted to backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
We talked briefly about the D-Day invasion and the work you were doing then of sort of preparing for amphibious landings. What were your thoughts on D-Day? Was that something that you said, well, I had a role in that even though I wasn't there?
Yeah, I had mixed feelings. I, in a way, wanted to get over there because that's where the action was. But the question is, over where? I had my heart set on Europe, but when I was going through officer candidate school, the focus of the war had shifted to the Pacific. And a lot of the guys that I had trained with, because I got letters, some of us corresponded, and I got mail from Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, some of the other islands, Philippines, and I didn't have any real desire. I didn't have any real desire to go there. I wanted to go to Europe, and I could have gone to Europe because when I took my discharge in California, where I was stationed at the time in '46, I came back. I drove back across the country, and I stopped off in Washington, and one of my classmates was a major, I think, captain or a major in the Pentagon. And I stopped in to chat with him, and he offered me a job in Germany if I would sign up for 3 more years in the Army.
Let's break now because we have to change tapes and continue
Sure.
the story.
Sure.
Harold, before our break, you were talking about your interest in being sent abroad to fight in Europe, but that wasn't necessarily your choice. Why don't we pick it up at that point?
All right, fine. You want me to elaborate on that? Yeah. At the end of '46, I was over 28, and I was wondering what the rest of my life was going to be like, because we had just come through a war period, and there were going to be millions of men just like myself who were going to be looking for jobs. I had no vocation, so to speak. I was not a technical man, and my college aspirations were to get into the diplomatic corps, and I kind of figured that at that stage of my life I'm not going to really make any progress in getting into the diplomatic corps or maybe even government. And my thoughts were that if I wanted to get married and raise a family, I'd have to make some money. And the question was how to do it. So having decided that I wouldn't continue my Army career, which I could have done, as I mentioned earlier, having turned down the opportunity to go to Germany and work in military government, which was what I was offered, I decided that I'd have to go to work. And so I took a very temporary job in the latter part of '46 after I'd severed my Army connection. And it was just a temporary thing for I think it was the Labor Department. doing a survey of housing in the 5 boroughs of New York. That lasted a month and was really of no consequence to me personally. It had no future. What to do next was the question. I decided then that I would go back to Rutgers and get my thesis finished and get a master's degree, because all the indications were that you couldn't get very far without a secondary degree. A BA meant very little, and even a master's degree was beginning to mean very little. So I went back to Rutgers. I finished my thesis, got my master's degree in '47, and then the question was what to do. So I went down to Wall Street, and I walked into an employment agency, and they said they had an opening at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Would I be interested? I said, sure. Well, within minutes, they made a call, and I was over at the Federal Reserve, 33 Liberty Street, being interviewed, and I was hired as a research economic assistant in the domestic research department. At that period of time, they had 2 research departments, domestic and foreign. I worked in the domestic department for about a year or more, and basically I was preparing reports on business conditions in New York City and the metropolitan area, which consisted of part of Connecticut and part of New Jersey, northern New Jersey. That was known as a statistical area, meaning that you dealt with statistics from that proscribed area. And I did that for, as I say, about a year and a quarter. Then they needed an opening occurred in the foreign department. And they asked me if I'd be interested. I said, sure. Well, you have to have some knowledge of languages to work in the foreign department. So they put me on the desk that covered France and the Low Countries, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg. And I read the reports, financial reports that came into the bank, and analyzed them and summarized them and gave my interpretation. Those reports went to the managers of the bank, the vice presidents, etc. And as it happened, my boss was the world's gold expert. In the first place, you got to understand the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is the largest bank in the world. It's the banker's bank. And one of my colleagues, aside from my boss, who was the gold expert, was a young man whom I've just recently found is in the spotlight on the world stage. He's one of President Obama's advisors. It's Paul Volcker. Paul is somewhat younger than me. I didn't think so, because he's so large. He's massive. And his office was about 20 feet away from where I worked. I didn't have an office. I was one of the crew, so to speak. And I really don't know what his job title was, because he was fresh out of Princeton. As I told you before, I could have gone there, but didn't. I might have been a classmate of his, I don't know. But at any rate, Paul Volcker worked close by. My only contact with him, other than saying hello in the morning and, good evening when we left the place, might have been in the cafeteria in the building. or at seminars. The Federal Reserve in those days had a routine that maybe once a month or thereabouts, they would invite prominent economists from around the area, Harvard, Yale, Brown, Princeton, Columbia, NYU, Fordham, who knows. And we'd sit down on in a conference room, which is huge. It's maybe 3 times, 4 times the size of this room. And it has a huge table that might be about, who knows, 35 feet long. And of course you get a lot of give and take at that kind of a session, because it's not just a speech, it's more of a discussion. And that was the only other contact I had with Paul Volcker was when my mother died in 1948, and he heard me, or heard that I had had that loss. He asked me to come into his office, and he tried to console me. We talked a little bit, but he's really come up in the world. I mean, he became Federal Reserve Chairman, and he's now right at the president's elbow.
In one of the interviews we conducted for this series with Stanley Van Ness, the state's public advocate, who later became director of the Prudential Insurance and served on the Prudential board with Paul Volcker.
Oh, really?
And I remember asking Stanley, was he ever intimidated by serving on the same board as Paul Volcker? And he said, definitely yes.
Oh, yeah. He's such a big fellow, such an imposing person that you can't help but being, as you said, I don't know whether intimidated, but, you're aware that here's a real personage.
Well, let's go back and continue the story at this point. You're at the Federal Reserve. Now, I take it from your chronology that you're taking the course from Arthur Burns really had no connection to your taking the job.
No, I don't think
saw
so.
the job and
no, I don't think it had. I don't know what I put on the application, but I don't think it had. I think the thing is that they needed somebody, and my background seemed to gel with them.
And did the experience at the Federal Reserve prove helpful later in your business career?
Oh, yes. It helps in this way, that in the first place, that has a prestige value on any application. You put that down and it opens eyes. In terms of, and from my personal knowledge experience, I learned how to handle statistics. We used to have a piece of equipment that was about 18 inches or 20 inches across, a metal box. And it was a calculator. Of course, nowadays, you've got all sorts of computers. But in those days, if you wanted to carry figures out to 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 decimal points, which we did, not all the time, but on occasion, you had to use a Frieden calculator. And what it would do is, as it hit another decimal point, the whole carriage, like a typewriter, would flip up and move to a different position. And one of the things that we used to do just for a lark, because, handling statistics day in and day out can get kind of boring, to say the least. Just to vary it, we would try to outguess the equipment. And we'd put the figures in and say quickly, it's going to come out to 6 decimal points, and the first one is going to be 1 or 2 or 3. And it was a game. It sharpens your wits. Like when I was a kid, I used to try to figure out what the batting averages were. or the ERA, that sort of thing. It has a tendency to make you think real quick like. And aside from that, writing the reports, you had to be focused. You had to realize the bosses that you're sending these to have limited time to read what you're writing, even though you think it's important. It isn't important to them unless they read it. And so you had to gear it to them to make sure that they would read it.
What year did you leave the Federal Reserve?
I think it was 49, if I'm not mistaken. It was either 49 or 50, I don't recall exactly.
And that was to go to Shell Oil?
No. The Shell Oil experience took place at the end of 46 and before I came to Rutgers in 47. It was only a period of about 4.5, 5 months, from about November, it's either October or November of 46, until the spring, say April or thereabouts. I went to summer school at Rutgers in 47. So that was only a short period of time, and as I said, that job ended in disagreement. Right?
And at Shell Oil, you were in a much different role than you were.
Oh yes, that was
Reserve.
editorial. That was putting a newspaper together. And I had very limited experience as far as newspapers are concerned. The only experience I had was in the Army, when as a sideline, when I was part of cadre training. The officer, my commanding officer, wanted once a week, I guess it was, newspaper, which was nothing more than a mimeographed sheet saying something about the troops. This one had a baby, this one got married, this one got engaged, personal notes. And maybe if an event took place, I put on some boxing matches as a sideline, arranged for the matching of fighters and having them tested by doctors before they went into the ring, and hired, when I say hired, named this guy or that guy to be a referee, that sort of thing. It was more in the nature of entertainment. Yeah. But turning out the newspaper, that I turned out about, I don't recall, maybe 20 or 30 of them. I put them together in a pile, and when I went for a job to show that I could write, I would present that. Yeah.
Well, let's go back to leaving the Federal Reserve, and what's the next step?
When I left the Federal Reserve, my brother had become a sales representative on his own for a couple of electronics firms, selling components that went into radio, because at the end of World War II, there was a shortage of electronic entertainment equipment. Radios, people were buying them by the millions, and they couldn't produce them fast enough. And then TV started to come along. TV was in its infancy, and you could sell all the components that you could make. And he was fortunate in that he built up a good reputation as a sales rep. And he had so much business that he didn't know how to handle it all. So he asked me, he says, "You're not making much money at the Federal Reserve," and they paid very little. Banks in those days, the salaries that you hear today are wild, are absolutely wild. But in those days, I don't recall what I was getting at the bank, but they gave me a $25 raise at the end of my first year. And I asked the fellow who was my immediate boss, superior, I said, is this all you get as a bonus, as an increase? He said, well, I've been here for I don't know how many, 10, 12 years. He says, I don't get much more than that. So I decided then and there that I didn't want that as a career. Might have been a mistake, I don't know, because Geithner has done well,
So
and
far.
a few of the others who headed up the Federation. But at any rate, be that as it may, I joined my brother. I had to shift gears because going from being a statistical analyst, an economic analyst, to being a salesman is a big shift. You have to deal with people instead of figures. You got to anticipate what their thinking is. And it took me, good 6, 8 months or so thereabouts to make that transition. But once I did, I became an excellent sales rep.
And of course, as you said, you'd had the training since you were a boy.
Exactly.
In your father's clothing store.
Exactly. And people, when I walked in, they liked me and gave me orders. You'd bring orders to the people you're working for, and that's what counts.
Is there anything similar about selling electronics to selling men's suits?
Yeah. Now, you asked me a while ago about how did I meet Yates. Is that what you are interested in?
At some point. But I don't want to push you too far ahead in the story.
Well, go ahead.
Well, Charlie Yates, who we both know well, you know him much better than I did, was a state senator, a candidate for governor at one point.
And also an assemblyman.
And an assemblyman. And a leading Democrat in Burlington County when Democrats were very few and far between.
Right.
But talk about your relationship with Charlie Yates and the business relationship and personal relationship.
Yeah. Well, I didn't meet Charlie Yates, the one that you referred to, the assemblyman, senator, etc., until much later on. When I say later on, I went into the electronics representation business in late 49, I guess it was. And after a couple of years, one day my brother called me and he says, "What are you doing Sunday?" I was, at that point, living in Englewood. I hadn't been married yet. And I said, "I'm free this Sunday." He says, "Well, there's a meeting I'd like you to come with me to. You might find interesting." It was in Englewood, up on the hill. When I say up the hill, Englewood has different sections, as you may be aware. And the hill section is where the wealthier people live. And we went to this house. I was introduced to the host, and he was a businessman in the tire business. Apparently he had a good business going. And he introduced my brother and I, to 2 other people. Yeah, I think there was only 2, 4, 5 of us there. One of whom was for the want of a better term, an all-around idea man in technical things, dealing with metals and chemicals. That was Charles Yates's father, Charles E. Yates. The Charles that you mentioned is Charles B. Yates, his son. Well, Charles E. Yates worked for Anaconda Copper, a very large producer of copper. And they were making copper foil for building materials, principally for roofing applications. And Charles Yates, E. Yates, was one of their key technicians down in Perth Amboy at the copper factory there. The other gentleman was a co-worker with him. When I say co-worker, not working down at Anaconda. The two of them had worked on the Manhattan Project up at Columbia University during World War II.
To build the atomic bomb.
Yeah, except they probably didn't know it was a bomb. I don't know whether they did or they didn't, but I don't think they did, because that was broken up into a lot of different segments. And some people out in Chicago or Columbia or Harvard or wherever the project was being put together may not have known each other, let alone what they were, how they fit into the bomb project. At any rate, the purpose of our meeting, they wanted to propose to the host and my brother and I, there might have been one other person, I don't recall, present, to set up a business to make copper foil, like what they were doing down at the Perth Amboy factory. But to make it for electronic uses, which meant making a finer quality product. If you use it for building material, it could be just copper foil. If you make it for electronic equipment, you can't have any pinholes. If you have pinholes in building material, it's really of no consequence, providing they're not big pinholes. At any rate, Charles Yates had done considerable improvement in the process, and so he asked us to set up a joint venture with them. They would supply the know-how, and we would supply the money. Venture capitalism is what it's called right now. But don't forget, this was 1950, I guess. At any rate, we agreed. We set up a factory down in Bordentown.
When you say we would supply the money, was it personal money?
Oh,
Was it
yes.
corporate money?
No. Personal money. Personal money. And it was a small amount. It wasn't a large amount. I don't recall whether it was, for all told, it might have been 100,000. You know, it's peanuts in today's terminology. At any rate, we did that. The business took hold, and before long, we had IBM, GE, Westinghouse, Motorola, you name it. Anybody who was anybody in electronics knocking at our door because they didn't like the foil that Anaconda Copper was supplying them with. It had too many pinholes. Mm-hmm. Ours had no pinholes.
Explain the importance of foil in the hardware.
Yeah, that's a good question. Foil was put onto a carrier, a board, a phenolic board, a plastic board. It was brownish in color, dark brown in color, cemented on, and then on top of that was put an electronic circuit, which meant little fine lines going from this component to that component to another component to another component.
That'd be a circuit board.
To make a circuit, right, exactly. And then that board with the ink on it, which would protect the area that they wanted to keep, you would put that board into an acid tank, and that would dissolve all of the copper except what you want, and that made the circuit. And then, of course, that was processed. Holes were put in so that you could mount a transformer or a condenser or a tuner or whatever to make the radio or see a television board. Of course, it's all different now. It's done a lot differently now. But at any rate, in those days, that's what they did. And we were number one. Everybody wanted our product. Now, to carry it a step further, every business at some point needs more capital, right? I had not yet met Charles B. Yates because he was only a youngster. He was probably still in high school, right? There's a big difference in age between my age and Charles B. There wasn't much of a difference between Charles E. Yates, his father, and me. Might have been 8, 10 years, something like that. But I was much older than Charlie, right? At any rate, one day at a board meeting, I was on the board of directors of the company. I said, you know, we're going to need a lot more capital. If we want more production, which we needed badly, to supply our customers, we've got to build a lot more equipment. We may need another building. So I suggested that we float a stock issue. And the board agreed with me. So I said, do you mind if I approach somebody in Wall Street? Well, I had a small account that I'd had there for years at the leading brokerage firm, in those days known as Hayden Stone. That was where all the wealthy people drove down in their limousines down to Wall Street and saw their brokers and maybe had lunch down there. So I went up to Hayden Stone, saw my broker and told him what I was there for. And he says, well, I don't handle that kind of thing. He says, but let me introduce you to Arthur Rock. I don't know if that name means anything to you. It probably doesn't mean anything to either of you. Arthur Rock was a Harvard graduate who struck it rich by, he was the lead guy in those days. This is now about 1958, 59, 60, right about there. He was making a name for himself, putting together some big deals, as they called them. And I was only a small deal. But Arthur Rock liked the idea that I presented to him because it was a different business. And he may not have appreciated the full range of it, but he understood that something was cooking. And he said, yeah, I think we'll be interested. And he introduced me to his boss. And I guess he was one of the vice presidents. And I said, why don't you come down and look us over? He said, yeah, I'd like to do that. So he came down, looked us over. He brought with him another vice president. And they were impressed. And so, of course, a couple of my colleagues, they wanted on the board, wanted their brokers to get it. So there was a little competition. Make a long story short, my broker won out. Hayden Stone did the deal. And if you go back to 1960 and read the newspapers, you'll find that I think we went under the name of circuit foil at the time. We changed it. Originally it was copper foil. And then somebody said, hasn't enough glamour. You got to have a little glamour. So they said, well, how about circuit? So we said, yeah, that's good. So we named it circuit foil. It came out at $7.50 a share. It was only 108,000 shares, small potatoes in terms of deals. And before long, it went up over $100. And we had to float additional stock. And it became a success story. And I don't know if I probably didn't bring those pictures with me, but I have pictures of Charles E. Yates, Charles B. Yates, who was just I guess at that point he might have been a college student, and his sister. He had an older sister, maybe she was a younger sister, anyway, and myself, my brother, and another one of our directors, and the president and vice president of the American Stock Exchange on the floor of the exchange. And then a few years later, we moved it over to the New York Stock Exchange, and then we changed the name to Yates Industries. So it became a real success story, not as big as Texas Instruments or IBM or RCA or, not in their league, but good sized.
You also had a career on Wall Street as an account executive. Why don't you discuss that a little bit with Shearson Hamel?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch.
As an account executive with Shearson Hamel.
Oh, me, yes. Yeah, what happened there, at one point around 1962, I guess it was, I guess it was 61. Around that time, I decided I'd had enough of being an electronic salesman. It got kind of wearing. I had to cross the George Washington Bridge in traffic maybe 2-3 times a day, and I didn't like fighting traffic. I didn't like sitting in a car so many hours to go from point A to point B. And I said, I got to do something that's more challenging than this. So I gave up my business. My brother had already gotten out of the business. He went down to live in Florida. And I sold what was left of the business and decided I would retire for a while. Well, I got tired of retirement in short order, and I applied for a job in the stock brokerage business. And I took the exam. I went through a training course for, I don't recall, 3-4 months. I passed the exam, and I became a stockbroker. So they call it, just a salesman. You're selling stocks and bonds. They give it a fancy title. They call it account executive. At any rate, I didn't like that business very much. It was just not my cup of tea. And in '63, I got onto it was either 62 or 63. I got interested in politics in my town. I went to a lot of board meetings, planning board, zoning board, council meetings. And one of the councilmen, a guy by the name of Raymond McGrath from Hudson County, Jersey City, he took a shine to me and he said, Harold, how would you like to be on the planning board? I said, fine. So he put my name in. The mayor and council approved. I became a planning board member. And while I was on the board, we rezoned a large tract of land that we wanted to keep an open space. It was it was just barren. It was wooded land, and they wanted to make golf courses out of them. And that was a way of keeping the land unbuilt on. So we approved 3 golf courses on a couple of hundred acres. I guess it was maybe 250, 275 acres or so. Of course, nowadays, it's been rezoned by subsequent planning board, and now it's full of, when I say multi-million, I'm talking about multi-million houses, mansions with who knows how many rooms, 15, 20 rooms.
Before we proceed, with your Bergen County political career, I wanted to bring you back about 10 years before. In 1952, at an Adlai Stevenson rally,
Yeah.
you meet your wife Reva, who's
Right.
sitting here eavesdropping and maybe heckling at some point. So you were involved in politics earlier in some way. Talk about that.
Yeah, my interest in active politics got going really after the 48 election. I was one of those who misjudged. See, I think it's the only election I've really misjudged, was Truman's victory. I was still at the Federal Reserve in 48, as you may recall. And if you recall from your history knowledge, Truman got awfully bad press. Awfully bad press. He was being written off. And I thought that the former Vice President, Wallace, was going to succeed. And of course, that didn't come to pass. And then, of course, it looked like Dewey was going to win the 48 election. So it came as a surprise to all of us. I sat up all through the night of that election, rejoicing in a way because I didn't want to see Dewey win. And when Truman won, I was ecstatic. So I went to work the next morning, bleary-eyed, and I was assigned to figure out what happened. So I went to the newspapers, delved into as many articles and magazine articles. And what happened in that election, a couple of things happened. In the first place, Truman made that whistle-stop tour, which did him immense goodwill. That was man to man, and the people loved it, and he hit the boondocks where people don't ordinarily see a presidential candidate. And old Harry had the old Missouri quality. He was one of them. And incidentally, his background and mine in politics, if you were to read Truman's biography and mine, you'd see some similarities because we were both freeholders, except he was called a commissioner.
And
fathers
who had haberdashery stores.
And that's right. And some of the things he did and I did were very similar when we were in office. At any rate, and he also could ride horseback. And that's another story, when he lost his glasses in battle, and he was blind. His eyesight was so poor, he didn't even know where the glasses were. Oh, you got to read that biography. At any rate, the other thing that happened, and a lot of people weren't aware of, and I certainly wasn't aware of it, there was a professor up at Cornell in the ag school who had predicted back in the summer, way before the election, that Truman was going to win. I missed that article. A lot of people missed that article because it apparently didn't reach everybody. But I found that article, and I read it, and it made a lot of sense. It had to do with the price of grain and corn. I don't recall the details, but Dewey had no knowledge of farm life. He was a city slicker, and he came across that way. And here's old Harry from the Farm Belt. It was a natural, and he won the election.
Well, let's get a little more personal and talk about your meeting with Reba and how that happened.
Oh, as I recall, we were at a house party. Well, we had been at a on Palisade Avenue, Englewood, there were all stores. And there was a store that was being used by the Democratic County Committee there for campaign purposes. And they had a rally, and I guess we both were there for the rally. And I had met her, and I guess we just said hello or whatever. And then the next thing, we were invited to a house party sponsored by one of the wealthier Democrats up on the Hill who had a big home. And we met there, and apparently there was a spark. And we started a date, and then a couple of years later we got married.
I thought it was 4 years later.
Yeah, there was another election. Yeah, we lost the '52 election, and then I don't know. We saw each other for a while, I guess. At any rate, I was dating other girls, and then in '56 we campaigned for Stevenson again, and there we started a date on a regular basis.
And what was Reba doing at that time?
Oh, she was working for Buitoni, the pasta people. You know, she was Mr. Buitoni's right-hand girl, or left-hand girl. What was he, right-handed or left-handed?
You talk loud.
At any rate, if he wanted to know whether the sauce was good or bad, he had her taste it. That was her job.
But she was a college graduate of Drew University, which was not...
She's a pasta taster.
Not very common in those days.
Hey, how do you like that for a title? Pasta taster.
Now, was your political involvement in those days simply campaigning for people or giving money, or how was it?
A little of both. I couldn't give very much. Well, I didn't give very much. I'm not a big spender. As a matter of fact, if you were to check the reports in Trenton, the election return reports, financial reports, I don't think there's anybody could match me for miserliness. I operated my campaigns on a shoestring.
Okay, well, let's now flip back where we sort of left off with your Bergen County political career,
right.
and take it there. You were on the planning board, and what happened next?
All right, what happened then? I was trying to get a brokerage license. I was going through a training course at a firm that is no longer in existence, Shearson Hamel, which subsequently became, it's now part of Citicorp. But in those days, Shearson Hamel, well, it was only Shearson at that time, as I recall. It didn't become Shearson Hamel until a couple of years later. Shearson had an office down at 90 Pine Street in New York, and they put me through a training program. One night, and I was still going through the course, one night in late February, or no, it had to be early March, because it was only a few days before filing deadline. You can check whatever the filing deadline. My recollection is sometime either in late March or early April. At any rate, one night I came home from the city. We were just sitting down to dinner. The phone rang. Reba picked it up and she says, Ruth Severio is on the phone. She wants to talk to you. So I picked it up and said, hi, Ruth. Ruth Severio was a county committee woman in Cresskill who was a very dedicated Democrat, very bright woman. And she knew that I was on the planning board. She knew that I had made some proposals that made the newspapers. And she put my name in, as a possible third candidate for freeholder of Bergen County. And she told me, she said, Harold, I hope you don't mind, but I've put your name in, and they need a candidate, third candidate. They're desperate. Bergen County Democrats had lost freeholder races for 52 years, going back to Woodrow Wilson's day. So you run out of candidates after a while. So I said, that's nice of you, Ruth. I said, I appreciate that, but I said, isn't that pushing it a little? Because in politics, you're supposed to lick stamps, you're supposed to close envelopes, you're supposed to put stuff in envelopes, you're supposed to make telephone calls. I said, I haven't been doing that. She said, forget about that. She said, I put your name in. Are you interested? I said, let me think about it overnight, Ruth. I said, I see some reason to do it, but I want to talk it over with Reba. I had already, in following the news, made up my mind back in 63 that Goldwater was going to run, and who was his opponent? Nelson, I think it was Nelson Rockefeller. And between the two, while I would prefer, not as a Democrat, but just as a voter, I would prefer to see Rockefeller head the Republican Party. But I knew that the conservatives were too strong to beat. And I figured Goldwater would be the candidate. If Goldwater ran, then I wanted to be on the ticket. And so the next day, after talking it over with Reba, said, this is wild. I said, I'm going to do it. So I told her yes. She says, all right, come in Thursday night or whatever. Come in. The county committee wants to interview you. Not the whole committee, but the county chairman, vice chairman, all the players. So I went in. There was a whole battery of people, I don't know, 10, 12, whatever. And they all fired questions at me. I had a resume that I gave them, and they were impressed. And make a long story short, they said yes, and they put my name on the ballot. But since two of the others had had some experience, Ben Mazer, whom I'm sure you knew, he had run for mayor of Fort Lee, he'd run for councilman, he'd run for freeholder, I don't know, 2 or 3 times. He headed the ticket, freeholder ticket. Gene Walsh, a young fellow, much younger than me, was a salesman for a paper company. He ran for council or mayor of Englewood and lost. Put him second, put me third. Make a long story short, I made very few speeches. I was in the entourage with Pete Williams, Governor Hughes, and others. Oh, there was a guy by the name of Holstowski, Henry Holstowski, who was the mayor of one of the towns in the south, East Rutherford. And he had been a school teacher, not a school teacher, a principal and superintendent of the school system there. A very bright guy.
Who would later be a congressman.
And he ran for Congress on the ticket. I made a few speeches here and there. My name appeared in the newspaper half a dozen times, maybe, on page 56. Also in the entourage was Harold Martin of Cresskill. And, make a long story short, the results came in. But before they came in, on election day, I don't know, in my pile of papers you'll find a story, newspaper story. On election day, I spent the day to burn off energy and to keep my nerves under control. I voted early, I went down to Sears Roebuck and I bought a humidifier to put into my heating system. And so I was cutting metal and inserting the equipment in, and I connected the thing up. And then I said, about 8 o'clock, I said, Reba, get dressed, we're going down to get the results. And I told her, I said, I think I'm going to win. We went down, we got the returns from our district, and I said, we have won this election. Why? Because my town is a swing town, basically Republican at that point, and the results came in indicating I was going to win. And I said, if we win here, then we're going to pick up certain other towns, and I'm convinced that we're going to be... At about 9:30, we went down to Hackensack headquarters, Democratic headquarters. We no sooner walk in than there's a shout, there's Harold! And they picked me up, and they put me on the shoulders of some big guys, and in Indian fashion, they marched around for maybe 20 minutes or a half hour doing an Indian chant. Harold Martin is won. The county boss, Danny Amster, came out and he said, hey, you guys, pipe down. We haven't heard from Saddle River. We haven't heard from Upper Saddle River. We haven't heard from Woodcliff Lake. We haven't heard from Marwa. We haven't heard from Ridgewood. All heavily Republican districts. Sure enough, after the returns were pretty well in, along about 2 o'clock in the morning or so, we went down to Henry Holstowski's tent in East Rutherford, right off of Route 3. Huge crowd down there, newspaper people, photographers, all over the place. Steve here would have loved to have been down there, I'm sure. At any rate, it was pretty clear that we had won that election, and it was historic. And I've got a letter from Pete Williams, I guess, that you may have seen, calling it an historic victory, and it was.
Apart from the help from the top of the ticket with the landslide for Johnson over Goldwater, were there more local issues in the county that helped?
Oh, yes, of course. After 52 years in office, maybe not with the same people, of course, but with the same kind of aura or mindset, you develop enemies. The Republicans had a lot of enemies amongst their own crew because this one didn't get a promotion, that one didn't get an increase in salary, this one's relative didn't get hired, somebody else got fired in the family, all sorts of, personal things. But there were also other issues. Bergen County, like other places, was growing. And there was a need for more care for the less fortunate, kids with disabilities, older people who needed transportation to go to doctors or dentists. And the road system, not that freeholders can do very much about that, but they get blamed for it. And so we capitalized on a lot of that stuff. We told them, look, there's a need to do this, a need to do that, a need to do something else, and let's do it. And it hit a sensitive nerve. Not only that, but I don't know whose idea it was. I'll say the county chairman deserves the credit. Danny Amster, who's now in a nursing home. He doesn't recognize anybody. I saw him, and he doesn't know who I am. He's changed. At any rate, they turned out a newspaper, and you'll have a copy of it in the material I gave you. It's called Profile of a Party. And I don't recall whether it's 12 pages or 14 pages or whatever. You'll find things like I've just been telling you about, things that we proposed to do, things that the Republicans didn't do, and pictures of us as a family. They got a picture of Reba and myself and our 4 kids and our dog. And the same thing with the other freeholder candidates. And it registered. It was a marvelous piece. And we won. And the interesting thing that you as a political scientist, and Jennifer would like to know, I am a statistician, and amongst other things, I took and analyzed I did that with all of my elections, even the ones that I lost. And surprisingly enough, if I had headed the ticket, I would have been congressman instead of Helstosky. I scored more votes in Bergen County. See, the district that Helstosky ran in covered North Bergen in Hudson County, as well as Bergen County. And his margin of victory was attributable to, in good part, to the votes he got in Democratic Hudson County. I outscored him. I don't know whether it's a few hundred or 1,000 votes or whatever. I outscored him. He was up at much higher up on the ticket. I think what happened, and the reason I ran ahead, my 2 colleagues almost lost. I would have only been the lone Democrat, freeholder. They barely won. They got by with, I don't know, 300 votes or 500 votes. I won by 25 or 2,600 votes. Now that meant, just for your information, that meant we turned around over 100,000 votes. That's a lot of votes. That's a lot of votes.
Of course, much later, in 1973 election, when you get elected to the Assembly, Brendan Byrne has said that he might not have run for governor if Congressman Helstosky had entered the race that year, because he didn't think he would...
You're raising a good point, because Bergen County is the premier county in terms of elections in New Jersey for 2, maybe 3 important reasons. The first reason is it's a very wealthy county. Morris comes close, but it's very wealthy. It's very large population, and a diverse population. Up until 1964, when I ran, it was basically a Republican stronghold. Right? If you lose 52 elections, the other guy has something. At any rate, the other reason that I would suggest to you is that a lot of our constituents work in New York City, and they have a different mindset. Those people, a lot of them, even though they may be Republicans, they are more independent. Just to give you an example, when I ran in 1964, I was invited to homes that did not like Goldwater. So I had an entree into Republican homes. And word of mouth is better than almost anything you can think of in politics. If people get on the phone and say, hey, I saw so-and-so today, and he's a wonderful guy, and I had a little dog, Frisky, a little mixed beagle, that everybody loved. Anybody who saw Frisky wanted to pick her up and hug her. And I used to walk that dog for miles through my town, through Alpine through Demarest, and she knew, more people knew Frisky at any rate, and that dog's picture was in the paper.
Now, the Democrats take control of the Freeholder Board in '64?
No, we didn't take control. We only won 3 seats.
3 seats.
We won 3. We were the minority. But we were a very vocal minority. And there were a couple of issues that came up. And one of my colleagues ran with that. There was a meat scandal. Over the years, apparently, the Republicans had seen fit to give contracts to a certain meat vendor in Hackensack. And I don't want to go into details because it's really academic at this point. But he turned that into an inquiry. And that made the headlines. The other thing that was important were mosquitoes. I headed the mosquito. I didn't head the commission because that's a separate commission, but I was the freeholder representative to the commission. In other words, their budget had to come to me for approval, and I sat in on their meetings. And when spring came, I would get into the mosquito boat. It's a motor-propelled boat that is a fan-propelled boat. You've seen them on television. And we'd go through the meadowlands, and my picture would appear in the newspapers, Freeholder Martin inspecting the mosquito problem, etc. So, you know, and it registers. And then, of course, we had the question of the community college. The question is where to put the community college. And I was instrumental in getting my recommendation, the man that I wanted, to head the study commission, which later became the commission that appointed the president of the college and the board on the college. I recommended a certain gentleman who was a head of a business, a big business, a man I had met, and he had impressed me. And it just so happened that he was selected. The Republicans, who had the majority, they agreed with me. I made my colleagues mad. My 2 Democrats wanted somebody else. But I said, look, let's put politics aside. I want the best person that I can find to go on that board. And he was appointed. And we got the college up and going.
And despite your best efforts, at the next election, you get beaten.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
And you want to know what happened? There's an old story that in politics there's a pendulum. And that pendulum swung and hit me in the head. And it knocked me out. But to put it into perspective, when you're in office and you do things that rub some people the wrong way, you lose some of your supporters. And we passed an income tax. Now, while we got it passed, and while it was popular for some of my supporters in some of the towns, in other towns, amongst other supporters, it may not have been popular. And so I may have lost some votes there. And then, of course, another factor, I spent very little money on advertising, a minimal amount. You'll find in the material I gave you, my biggest asset was a very small card, about 1 1/4 inches high by about 3 or 4 inches long. It had my picture and a few words, very few words. Basically, it was a calling card. That was my biggest expenditure for the campaign. I handed out thousands and thousands of them. But that's apparently not enough, particularly when the tide is running against you. And in '79, it ran against us, but it ran against us for another reason. Jimmy Carter was running for president. He was running for a re-election in '79. And there were some American soldiers who were kept hostage in Iran. And that was a big negative in that campaign.
Well, let me bring you back, because we'll deal with that, I think, during your assembly career. But I wanted to go back to your mention that you campaigned, at least briefly, with Governor Hughes in those days when you were running for freeholder.
Yep.
We've heard during the series of these interviews various comments about Governor Hughes as a politician. What was your own take on Governor Hughes?
My take on my impression of Governor Hughes, in the first place, I had not met him until I ran for freeholder. And I was with him many, many times on the campaign trail. He impressed me. I was aware that there were people who were saying he's not dynamic, he doesn't speak that well, he doesn't excite people, a whole host of things, that he's a small-town country lawyer, a whole raft of negatives. I met him, I was on the trail with him, and I was fascinated by his ability on a low key to get people's goodwill. He may not have excited them the way Pete Williams could do, because Pete Williams was an orator. He couldn't excite them the way Henry Hill Stosky could, because he was a firebrand, a very knowledgeable one. And so my impression was that if I wanted to copy anybody, I wanted to copy Hughes, because I couldn't be a Pete Williams. Pete had a certain talent for speaking. And I certainly couldn't be a Hal Stosky, because I don't believe in bombast. And so who would I get my political smarts from? I watched Dick Hughes, and what he would do is come into a house. He excelled at this. He'd come in. First thing he'd do when the event started, when he was introduced by the host, and sometimes it was only a small group. It might have been 10 people, 12 people, neighbors, you know. Other times there might have been 30 people in the living room. He would turn to the host and say, "Thank you," you know, real, genuine, from the heart kind of thing. And then he would talk on a person-to-person basis. And he would ask people, well, if you have a question, I'll be happy to answer. It was a very simple, direct approach. And I found that that was a real smart thing to do. And he got a lot of friends. He made a lot of friends. And he won.
Okay, now let's talk. You're beaten after serving a 3-year term as freeholder. You're out of elected office. Or you're just focusing back now on the business career?
When I finished with freeholdering, I became a man of leisure. We had 4 kids growing up. We took trips, went down to Mexico with them, drove down, up and back, took them on flights to various places, including Europe. Maybe not all of them at once, but my political activity was I kept my foot in the door. I went to county committee meetings. If there was something on a state level that interested me, I attended. I kept reasonably active and came, it's like printer's ink. Once you turn out a newspaper or have a part in it, it's almost a part of you. And so politics was still in my blood. Came 73, when I saw Nixon in trouble, I said, I'd like to run. And so I got 100 signatures and put them into the pot, and I got the nomination with no contest. The primary, of course, was academic, and the election was close, but I won.
Of course, this is for the Assembly.
For the Assembly, yeah. And one of the things that occurred, my first opponent was a doctor, an ear, nose, and throat doctor in Englewood. Nice guy, but a very, very conservative man. And lo and behold, at some point, I remember now, the financial returns, reports that we had to make, I submitted mine, and when I submitted it, I decided to look at my opponent's return. And lo and behold, money coming out of Virginia. So I called up the county headquarters and I said, can you have somebody trace where this money is coming from? It turned out there was a certain gentleman by the name of Richard Vigueri, or Vigori, I don't know how he pronounced it, whom I'm sure you're aware of, and there's no need for me to go into detail.
Well, for the record, give
yeah,
a brief,
for the record,
brief
all right.
profile.
For the record, he was one of the people who stays in the background to some extent, although he got a lot of publicity, who furthers the cause of conservatism. Now, I'd like to think of it more as reactionism. And he would go into districts that were questionable. And since District 39, my district, was a district that they wanted desperately to win because they knew I had won as freeholder, and they were afraid I would score an upset in District 39, so they poured money into my opponent's campaign. And I wanted that to be made public knowledge. And so the county picked it up and made it a newspaper article. I think that helped. Be that as it may, I pulled out, the other thing, was one other factor there. My other opponent was the mayor of Dumont, a larger town than mine, very next town to mine. And he had a reputation of hitting the bottle. And so I think he lost a lot of Dumont votes that I may have picked up. And of course, word gets around. You can't hide that sort of thing.
Of course, in addition to the problems affecting Republicans on the national level,
Oh,
the
of
Watergate
course.
scandal.
Oh, yes. I should have mentioned that by all means. The biggest factor, of course, was the Watergate with Richard Nixon and the missing tapes. Of course, that was the issue. That was the issue. But on the local level, bringing it down on the district level, there has to be an added factor, and I've mentioned them.
Well, how much impact did the state problems affecting the Cahill administration have in your decision?
Not really. I don't think I really gave that, I think I gave that short shrift. I was focused on primarily on Nixon and Watergate. I thought that was a wonderful time to run as a Democrat, and it was.
And of course, at the top of the state ticket, Brendan Byrne enters the race after serving as a judge. Surprisingly, Governor Cahill, the incumbent governor, gets beaten in the Republican primary, and Congressman Sandman,
Yes, of course. That was
a conservative and a Nixon defender in the Watergate scandal, becomes the Republican nominee against Brendan Byrne at that time. What did you see as the impact at the assembly level in your race to this turn of events?
Oh, there's no question. You can tell I'm getting old. I should have mentioned that before you raised the question, because it was obvious that if Sandman were to knock off Cahill, as you know, was not a conservative by any means. As a matter of fact, some people thought he was a Democrat in Republican dress. At any rate, I think it was pretty obvious that with Sandman in place of Cahill, that they were going to lose a lot of votes. Oh yes. So there were really two major factors: the Watergate and the Sandman upset.
What role, if any, did you take in the Democratic gubernatorial primary in the candidates opposing Brendan Byrne?
Oh, well, I went to, I don't know if I told you this off camera, but somewhere along the line, when it became obvious that Brendan Byrne was going to have opposition from some of his co-workers, shall we say, that he would perhaps get into a state of mind where he would be uncertain as to whether he would want to run.
Well, I'm talking now about 1973.
Oh, you're talking about 73. Oh, 73, I think there was no question in my mind that Brendan Byrne would be a tremendous asset to the program, to the campaign. And I was delighted, really delighted, when he won the nomination.
But I assume your focus, at least in the early part of the campaign, was simply on your own race rather than on the gubernatorial level.
Well, split, because I know that you have to have a lot of support. There has to be a spin-off from the top to come down to the district level to bring you in. And in my district, in District 39, you need all the support you can get as a Democrat.
Of course, on election day, you are elected to the Assembly. Do you remember the sort of party or the reaction election night?
You know, election night of 73, I don't rightly recall. I'm searching my mind. I don't recall what we did. I know there was a celebration. We probably went down to Democratic headquarters. And I don't know whether that was the time that there was one election where we tried to get into South Hackensack, I think, Little Ferry. For some reason or other, they were holding a party there, and it was a rainy night, and we never could get to the party because Route 3 was Route 3? No, Route 46, excuse me, underwater by about 18 inches or so. We couldn't cross Route 46 to get to the party. But I'm not sure which election it was. After a while, a lot of elections merged
together. We have to take another break.
Sure.
Harold, we stopped before we broke at the 1973 election. You were elected to the Assembly. Brendan Byrne is elected governor. Discuss, I guess, going down to Trenton and what the legislature was like in those days. Who were the key people that you first met?
Yeah, as I recall, when we won that election, it was like a landslide in terms of bodies. When I say bodies, Assembly and senators in Trenton. My recollection, and you can check the figures, you have the data, we became the majority party by quite a margin. I think we had 66 Democrats and 14 Republicans, to the best of my knowledge. And that represented a major turnaround for a couple of reasons. In the first place, with such a large majority, you don't have to worry about one or two votes when it comes time to pass a bill. And that was one thing. Of course, the other thing, major, is that you get to occupy the key positions, being the Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, the majority leaders in both houses, committee chairman, and you have almost a free hand in legislating. And we did. We went ahead. Of course, it has its downside because some people, either man or woman, gets to think that they can do no wrong. And egos start to clash. And but by and large, we got along pretty well. We had a speaker who was very temperate. Howard Woodson was as I recall, our first speaker. He was followed by Joe LaFonte. And after Joe LaFonte, I think it was Bill Hamilton, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And all three very competent, very good men. And we had Al Burstein as our majority leader. And we got along fine. And the atmosphere was one of compatibility. Tom Kean was the leader of the Republicans in the Assembly, and he's a very moderate type of individual, knowledgeable, experienced legislator. So we got along fine.
Of course, one downside of having such a supermajority is maintaining party discipline because you have so many votes.
Yes.
It's sort of difficult to keep the troops in check, isn't it?
Of course.
And as Brendan Byrne takes office, things seem to be going very well. He implements the odd-even gasoline rationing program during the Arab oil boycott.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because coming from Bergen County, I had an hour and 20-minute ride or an hour and a half ride, depending upon traffic. And I used to use the turnpike to Newark and then take Route 1 down. Sometimes I'd take the turnpike all the way down. It depended. And a good deal of it depended on whether I could get gasoline. And so sometimes you'd have to wait in line, and sometimes it could be a pretty long wait. So it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to get to Trenton on a number of occasions. And sometimes, on a couple of occasions, even though we had free passes on the, I guess they called it the Pennsylvania Railroad in those days. That was before Amtrak. At any rate, using the railroad pass meant driving down to Newark, getting into a parking lot, paying for a day's parking, getting on the train. When I got down to Trenton, I didn't do this very often. I think I only did it 3 or 4 times, walking or taking a cab from the rail station to the State House. And you'd get to the State House, and sometimes nothing would happen during the day. You'd have committee meetings. Sometimes a committee meeting wouldn't take place. Somebody didn't show up, or maybe the bill hadn't been printed. Whatever the reason, you'd spend a day and you'd say, it's lost. Or, on the other hand, if I were lucky enough maybe to get a ride back to Newark, as happened on a couple of occasions, I'd get a ride back with a guy by the name of Mike Adebato, one of my colleagues, whom you may remember. Well, Mike had a very unusual habit of starting to speak when you'd get going, and he would turn his head toward you, not facing traffic, and he would talk without stop until you got to Newark. By that time, you were stone deaf.
He was a very colorful
to say the least.
I had my own personal stories, but
he was a nice guy, a very nice guy. He'd give you the shirt off his back as long as you bought his insurance policy from him.
Yeah. He actually kissed me on the lips once when we signed a bill that he wanted. So. Only time that ever happened. But despite Governor Burns' early success in the first few months of the administration, soon the school and tax issues come to haunt the administration in that first year.
Oh, and how?
Talk about that from your perspective.
Yeah, well, those two, you put your finger right on them. Let's talk about the tax issue first, although maybe it'd be best to take the education thing first. There was an assemblywoman, Garvin, from Newark, a black woman who was very intelligent, highly intelligent, very nice, likable. She, as I recall, was one of the committee people. There was Senator Winona Lipman, also black, from Newark, also highly intelligent with several degrees from prestigious universities. And Al Burstein from Bergen County, from the adjoining district to mine, District 37, followed by name of Danny Newman, a plumber from Ocean County, who is also a very nice guy, a very outspoken individual. And there was a guy by the name of Brian Kennedy, as I recall, was also on the Education Committee, and Senator John Ewing, also on the Education Committee. And I'm trying to think who else. Well, right off at the moment, those were the major... Senator Steve Wiley, of course, who I believe was the chairman of the Education Committee in the Senate. And we were like a traveling troupe. And I say that advisedly because I don't think there was a school district in the state of New Jersey that we didn't visit. And we heard from the ordinary citizens, but primarily we heard from principals, superintendents, teachers, the establishment, teaching establishment. And we heard, I forget how many hours, I didn't keep track of them, but it was a lot of hours, a really lot of hours. And people started to make fun, particularly in newspaper articles. As you know, the Constitution of New Jersey, back in 1868, was it, or something?
44.
Some such figure, put into the Constitution when it made its changes, revised the Constitution, the words thorough and efficient, that every school child in the state of New Jersey shall be given a thorough and efficient education. Well, that lent itself to many interpretations by many interpreters. And after a while, some people started to make fun of it and used another word for T and another word for E. I won't go into that, but at any rate, make a long story short, we were at our wits' end, and that led into the income tax, because T&E, as we interpreted it on the committees, and I use the word advisedly, they had the Assembly Education Committee, you had the Senate Education Committee, and then you had something called the Committee on the Public Schools, which was a combination of the two legislative committees, by and large. And we all tried to come up with an answer to thorough and efficient. And the best that we could figure out was that the legislators who revised the Constitution, who knows what they thought, but we thought that what they meant was that the only way you could guarantee a kid a thorough and efficient education was to put sufficient money behind his training, his or her training. And that meant hiring good teachers, good administrators, providing them with books, providing them with buildings that are in good condition, which incidentally a lot of our buildings are not. Some of them had leaky roofs, some of them had toilets that didn't operate, and some where they didn't have adequate books, and all the rest of it. It's a very complex subject, and you can't go into it in a couple of minutes. But the net result was that we figured that it would take a lot more money than the state was providing to provide a thorough and efficient education. Well, that bumped up against the budget. And so we had to find a new source of money. And that's when the income tax discussions started to come up. And the first bill that was introduced for the income tax was a bill introduced by Senator Steve Persky. Well, he was assemblyman. He was assemblyman in those days from Atlantic County. And there were, I don't recall whether there were 3 or 4 co-sponsors that he had gotten. The bill was being circulated in the Assembly the Assembly caucus. I saw a copy of the bill, and since I have long been, for many, many years, long before I got into the legislature, I was convinced that the only proper way to raise, for government to raise money, was for a graduated income tax based upon ability to pay. And when I saw the bill, I read it, and I said, I want my name on this bill. And a lot of my colleagues said, you're crazy. You'll kill yourself. You won't get reelected. I said, well, I don't know whether I'll be reelected anyway. I want my name on the bill. So I got a copy of the bill, and I signed it. And Steve, of course, was happy, and I forget who. I don't recall whether Bill Hamilton's name was on it. I don't recall who else's names were on that bill. But there were only at most, maybe 4 names. And my name became the 5th name. And then the bill, of course, as you know, ran into trouble. It was hard to sell the idea of an income tax. It always has been. not just here in New Jersey, but almost any place. And so a court case went through the system, and at that point we had a very intelligent judge by the name of Dick Hughes, and the majority of the court decided that they would close the schools in September.
July.
In July, right. July. If the legislature didn't come up with money to satisfy T&E. And so then the bill came up in the legislature, and a lot of people were surprised. I was one of the last to vote for the bill. I don't know whether you know that. It was the speeches, as you know, droned on for hours and hours and hours on end. Somewhere in the morning, I don't know whether it was 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, I had a call from the governor's office. I don't know who called me in, whether it was Jerry English or Luke Hayden or Dick Leone. Somebody said, "Harold, the governor wants to talk to you." So I went in, bleary-eyed. I had no idea whether it was night, morning, or whatever, or what day it was. And Brendan was in his chair. The Attorney General, Billy Highland, was there, and I was here. They wanted to know why I wasn't voting for the bill. I said, because I don't think it's going to raise enough money. Instead of 2% or whatever it was, I said, I think we ought to have 3, 3.5, 4, maybe 5. If we're going to do it, let's do it right. Let's not do it twice. Well, they weren't convinced. They agreed with me in principle, but they said, look, this is what we got. We got 39 votes or something like that. We need your vote. I said, well, I'm going to vote for it, but I don't like it. I'd like to have more. So I went out and I voted. And then, as you probably are aware, there are some people who vote because so-and-so else voted. Well, there were 2 other votes who, after I realized what happened, I said, yeah, those guys, they always vote after me. They always vote after me. And they voted, and it passed.
Who were those other 2?
I think one of them was Gregorio. I can't, I don't want to put them in the spot because they may have had their own reasons. It's possible. It's possible they had their own reasons. I don't know. I can't read their minds. One was Gregorio, and the other was also, I think, from his area, district. If you take a look, if you dig up the vote, I don't know whether it'll show you the time that the vote was. No, it probably doesn't show you the time, but no, there was another assemblyman besides Gregorio. I can't think of it. Was it Cali? No, I'm not sure. But there were 2 votes that as soon as I voted, they come in.
Of course, we're talking about the 1976, when the income tax passed after a couple earlier failures for the Byrd administration. And there was some discussion that after the governor's program failed in his first attempts, that the legislature should sort of take the lead more than the governor, because the governor's popularity had declined significantly since his election in '73, and also that the legislature was feeling, well, this should be our program. Did you see it that way, that the legislature was sort of asserting itself more than the executive, or was that a strategy that the Byrne administration was pushing from behind the scenes?
Well, a couple of things you got to keep in mind. I'm sure you're aware of it, but when something is on, when I say something, a bill is on the table, when you got to do something with it, people begin to firm up their opinions. They know that they've got to make a decision. And you got to recognize that this thing had been cooking for a couple of years. Actually, it was cooking for many years before, in some fashion. The need for additional income was present back in the 60s. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the sales tax. And legislators are sensitive animals, if I can use that word. They hear from their constituents. This constituent wants this kind of service, and this one wants that kind of service. The roads need repair. You need this, you need that. And sooner or later it gets to you. You recognize that you got to do something. And then there was the court case. And they weren't going to let the schools close. Oh, to have the schools close in July, oh my goodness, that would have been disaster from a public relations standpoint.
There's been some talk that the Byrne administration's problems were somewhat exacerbated by failure to communicate with the legislators in their own language, that the Byrne key staff, particularly the counsel, Lou Caden, and the treasurer, Richard Leone, personalities didn't quite mesh with the average legislator.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yes, it was true. There were many aspersions cast in the direction of certain individuals. And I think it was basically a couple of things. Personalities. Some of these people exceedingly talented, no question about it. I don't want to name names, but you know them as well as I do. Their personalities just didn't mesh with certain legislators who had egos, who didn't want to be talked down to. After all, they were the legislators, and these people were only staff, And who's going to tell whom what to do? So you got that factor. And I don't know what else motivated them to hold it against them, but maybe just that. Who knows?
How about Brendan Byrne himself? How was his relationship with the legislature in leadership meetings or just one-on-one meetings?
I'm sorry to say, because I have a deep affinity, forget about politics, deep affinity for Brendan Byrne. Number one, his ability in terms of knowing what to do is right on target. I mean, you got into a situation where it was tough, and he had some tough problems. The school, T&E, the funding, what kind of funding how to raise the money, plus all the other things that the legislature is concerned with, from prisons to health institutions, whether to close down this facility or build a new one or whatever. So that it's a tough job. And you're dealing with 40 prima donnas in the Senate and 80 prima donnas in the Assembly, and it's a tough proposition. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So it's tough. But his personality is a low-key personality. And some people thought it was too low. Some people said, well, you got to have guts. You got to, you got to speak up. Well, perhaps there's some truth in that. So, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But I appreciated his humor. I thought some of his gags and his ad-libs were fabulous.
Now, you were appointed to key roles in this debate over school funding and tax policy in New Jersey. Was that something you sought out? Did you ask to, take on these roles, or did other people come to you and say, given your financial background and your business background, we think that, you should serve in these roles?
I'm glad you asked that question because, there are many times when I ask myself that question. And I have a tendency at times to sit back, as I did with the freeholder, when I was freeholder. I would, just to digress for a moment, with the freeholders we had a table 3 times the size of this, in a room a little bit bigger than this. 9 people. Sometimes we'd call in an aide, an assistant county counsel, a clerk, or whatever. But for the most part, there were 9 people sitting there. I would sit quietly, purposely. I wanted to hear what so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. I wanted to hear what all of my colleagues had to say before I would open my mouth. And I found that that's the surest way to get respect. Now, 2 of my colleagues didn't do that. They would come on, one or the other would come on, and they were suspect. I got along better, I must say, with my Republican colleagues than I got on with my Democratic colleagues. And I found that sometimes my Republican friends would side with me, and I would win. As I told you a little while ago, the man that I named for the County College Commission got the job. And I found that that works. And I did the same thing in the legislature. I kept my mouth shut until I heard as much as I thought was cogent for me to then voice my opinion. And you may not know it, and I'm sure you haven't heard, or maybe you did hear. There was one incident, just to give you an example. It was a caucus, and it was a mixed caucus, and it had to do with T&E and raising money. And who came into the caucus? I don't recall everybody that was there. There weren't that many people. It might have been, I'd say offhand, maybe 25 of us, down in the basement of the State House, in the Democratic caucus room. I don't recall who conducted the meeting. Well, Morlino was there, I know. Al Burstein was there. I don't know whether Tom Kane was there. I don't think he was. But Al Beatleston, the Dean of the Senate, a man probably 10 years older than myself. He'd been in the Senate for who knows how long. And he was holding forth on what he thought we ought to do and telling us his vast experience, he would do that. I didn't like what he was saying. And so I, in a low-key way, not offending him, I took him on in debate. Well, would you believe, the very next day I got a letter from Joe Molino, who was president of the Senate, I think, at that time. And you probably have it in the material I gave you, saying, you got guts, Harold, to take on the Dean of the Senate when you're only a freshman. And word, as you know about the State House, it only takes 2 seconds beyond the meeting for word to get around. So, you know, that partially answers your... I didn't seek the chairmanship. I didn't know they were going to ask me to do it. You know, I was delighted when they did. You know, being chairman, you call the bills. You know, you take the vote.
Of course, you mentioned before that you were advised not to put your name on the income tax bill.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the possible political repercussions.
Yeah.
And even before the income tax passed and was enacted into law in 1976, you had an election in 1975 where you had to stand for re-election, where you squeaked through, won by 995 votes.
What happened there, my first running mate, a guy named Herb Gladstone, did not get renominated. I don't want to go into the details of that, but he didn't get the nomination. I don't think he tried to get the nomination. And so they picked a teacher, a high school teacher from New Milford by the name of Fred Sharkey. Nice fellow. Somewhat younger than myself, maybe by 15, 20 years younger. He was an outspoken kind of guy, ready to talk quickly, maybe not think things through. And he was opposed to the income tax. I told him, I said, Fred, I think you're making a mistake. In our district, a lot of our constituents work in New York. They pay New York State income tax. If we pass a New Jersey income tax, they'll get a credit. They'll save some money. And they'll be for us. It was only at the last moment, maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the election, that he gingerly admitted that he might support an income tax. I think that cost him the election. He lost by 250 or 500 votes, I don't recall, small amount. And he asked for a recount, and he lost on the recount. But I got through.
Were you optimistic about that election, or did you see the handwriting on the wall that the popular sentiment had turned against Governor Byrne?
I thought it would be a squeaker. I thought it would be a squeaker. I wasn't absolutely, you know, it wasn't like 73. I know that there's a pendulum, and I know that I wouldn't have Brendan Byrne at the top of the ticket, that I'd be at the top of the ticket.
How did you handle, though, the fact that Brendan Byrne was the governor? Was that used as an attack against you by the Republicans?
You know something, at this point, I don't recall. I supported him right down the line, made no bones about it. I don't know, I'd have to go back and look at the press releases, you know.
Because in fact, according to my numbers, the Democratic majority went from 66 to 14 to 49 to 31.
Oh, yes.
After that 75
Oh, yes,
election.
we lost seats. Yes, we lost seats. We lost seats. As a matter of fact, we lost a seat in my district because my running mate lost, and we picked up John Market from Washington Township.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first term of the Byrne administration is dominated by the income tax and the school funding reform. But the political damage is such that people are starting to talk about one-term Byrne and wondering whether he'll even seek re-election. How did you feel?
I wanted him to seek re-election. I always feel that the incumbent, unless he commits the kind of crime like Spitzer or whoever, goes beyond the pale, that they're entitled to another shot at it. And I thought that he served well, and I agreed with him in principle. So I had no difficulty supporting him. But when we come to the 77 election, which you probably want to lead into, when we came to 77, what happened there, I had two, when I say I asked Greta Kiernan, who had been my legislative aide, to join me on the ticket. I felt I needed somebody with her knowledge, because she's very knowledgeable in government. She had been very active in the League of Women Voters, and she understood government. She knew it. And she had been a good aide to me. And I wanted her to be on the ticket to get whatever support she could bring in, because I knew it was going to be a tough race. The Republicans were really gearing to take back that seat, and the conservatives from Virginia and wherever were going to put money into this. And as I told you, I'm a very low spender. I don't care. I'm not going to use money to buy an election. I will not do that. Even on my second and third runs, I spent very, very little. And the returns in Trenton will bear that out. Whatever I got in the way of contributions, that was it. Plus a contribution on my own behalf, which was limited, very limited. What happened there, the Republicans picked two candidates, one of whom he's now Senator, Jerry Cardinale, and he's a dentist, as you know, practicing dentist, and a guy by the name of John Inganamort, a builder. Now, John Inganamort is a nice guy, and in 1964 he was one of my supporters. I don't know what party he belonged to at that time, but he contributed to the Democratic victory. Of course, as a builder, he could be expected to contribute to either party, or both. And he probably did. But at any rate, Inganamort was not really a politician. Big guy, nice guy, a lot of money and all that. The Jerry Cardinale and John Inganamort, who had now become a Republican Party operative, a candidate, they ran an ad in the newspapers. And they took off their jackets. And they put their jackets over their shoulder, like this, hanging, to show that they are with the common people. They're, macho guys. Well, every year, the Bethel Temple in Closter would hold a pre-election candidates day on Sunday, because Saturday is verboten. On Sunday, they had their breakfast, and they invited us all. And I was wondering, how can I cut these guys down to size? Because Cardinale is a hellfire type of candidate, and he knows how to speak. He knows which issues to cover, which red hot buttons to push. And Ganamort, well, who knows? I don't think he was much of a, public speaker. So at any rate, came the breakfast. These two guys get up with their over-the-shoulder business. I get up there dressed in a suit and tie, and I said, Before I make my speech to you, I hope you don't mind if I take my jacket off, and I did it with a gesture, you know, and I put it over my shoulder, and I said, now, let's start talking politics. Well, the audience just roared. They weren't laughing at me. They were laughing at them. They were laughing at, and the press made hay with that. And the people read the record, and the other newspapers. Plus the fact, in all three of my elections, all three of my campaigns, I had the support of all of the newspapers, every one of them. Every one of them recommended that I and my running mate be elected.
Of course, in those days, the newspaper endorsements were probably a lot more important than they are today.
Oh, yeah, a lot more important than they are today. Yeah, yeah. But a lot of people who were in that audience, not just the people in Closter, but, you know, others who came, oh, they roared. They thought that was, you know, it just was a last minute, I didn't know what else to do, and that did it.
Mm-hmm. On the gubernatorial level, what was your take on the Byrne-Bateman campaign from the beginning, right after the primary, through the general election?
I thought Brendan had the upper hand. I didn't think that Bateman's personality, he's a very nice guy. I have great respect for Ray Bateman. He's talented, qualified, no question about it. And he'd probably make a good governor. I think he would have made a better government than somebody else I could mention.
Don't want to mention them?
Republican, of course.
Yeah. Were you surprised, though, about the swing in public opinion from the beginning of the campaign, the general election campaign, through November?
Surprised? Not really, not really.
Let me put it another way. If you were running the Bateman campaign, what strategy would you have suggested that might have been more effective?
Gee, that's a tough one. I don't know what I would have suggested, because every campaign is different. It has its own feel to it. I think that Ray was too low-key, for one thing. He is a low-key guy. And I think he also may have suffered from the fact that he's a moderate. And the Republican Party, and what's killing them now, you know, you don't have to be a political expert to understand this. There is a terrible split which goes way back. It goes back to the time I was a student here, to 1940. When Wilkie and Taft split the party, you know, it's there, and it doesn't go away.
On election night, where were you? Up in your district or at state headquarters? Don't you remember?
I think I was home on election night. Now wait a second. That was a night, I don't recall. You know, after a while, things have a tendency to merge. There was one election, it was the second election, I guess. It might have been the third, where I was down at county headquarters. Yeah. I don't recall which one of them it was, but when they started to see the returns in my district and see that I was going to win, not lose, because I was pretty much given up. It was maybe the second election, maybe 75, excuse me, where I think they were writing me off. The way you can check this, Don, the Democratic State Committee turned out a newspaper. Dick Coffey was the genius behind that, brains behind that. They turned out a newspaper right after the election, said, Martin wins in 39th, because that was the big win. I was written off. And I think that might have been the second election. Yeah, that might have been 75.
Well, in 77 on Election Day, and I recall this, there was a terrible rainstorm.
Well, that's...
In North Jersey and Manhattan.
Yeah, that's the one where we had that problem crossing Route 46 then. That's it.
But also, from the standpoint of the election, there was concern, and you mentioned this before, that the commuters who worked in Manhattan
I think
would
that
be
makes a
stranded
difference.
in Manhattan, wouldn't be able to get back to vote, and that they would have been pro-Democratic, pro-Burn voters because of the impact of the income tax on their bottom lines. Do you remember that, or do you remember being concerned about the turnout in your own election because of that storm?
To be honest with you, I don't recall. I just went down to the town, to my district, and got my votes, and I waited for the rest of them to come in because, unlike 64, I was not sure. 64, it was very clear early on that I was going to win that election. But that was because of Watergate and not Watergate, Goldwater and Johnson.
Well, Governor Byrne and you were reelected in 77.
Right.
And in the second term, the Byrne administration turns to other issues. The school funding and tax issues don't go away, and there's lots more that's happened since. But let's talk about some of the other issues that you dealt with while you're in the Assembly.
Well, I can't, my memory is not that good that I can pinpoint things, but there are several things that stand out in my memory as memorable in my service in the legislature. The big thing that I think had the biggest impact of all the things that I did in my period in the legislature, I think it was in 76. It was after the election of 75. We met to reconstitute the Assembly. And the first order of business was to bring up the rules. And I was so fed up, I was almost on the border of quitting the legislature because I had been a smoker back in the 40s, picked it up in the Army, and I got to be a 2-pack a day in the 50s. And I quit because I had a terrible cold or flu or something, and the taste of tobacco was terrible. So I quit. That was in 52, when Eisenhower ran. I remember the two, quitting smoking and Eisenhower's election. I couldn't stand the smoke in the Assembly. There were days, as you well know, when the level of smoke was so thick that I had difficulty seeing across the room. And between the heat and the smoke, it was driving me up a wall because I have a little bit of a breathing problem. And I was determined either they gave up smoking or I would quit the legislature. So at the very last moment, just before the vote on the rules, I put in a one-sentence amendment to the rules. And I remember, I think Chris Jackman was in the chair, and he was ready, fit to be tied. He made faces at me. At any rate, that rule, after about an hour or two of debate, squeaked by. I don't recall what the vote was, somewhere 36 or 38 to 32 or whatever. But the rule was adopted. And it, as you know, subsequently, years later, the Senate barred smoking, And then you had a law barring smoking. So I can take credit, legitimately, for stopping smoking in New Jersey. That's a heck of a big accomplishment. That's monumental. I mean, that's changing people's habits. What can be more basic than that? The other thing that I'm proud of, I have scoliosis. It's moderate. It's not going to kill me, I don't think so. If it does, I've lived long enough. But a couple of our girls' friends happen to be sisters, two sisters, friends of my younger daughter, I think it is, had to be operated on. Big operations for scoliosis. So the first thing I did when I got into the legislature was to put in a bill to call for yearly visual examinations of all school children in New Jersey. And that passed. That became law. The other thing that, an accomplishment, Child Custody Act. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but up until I introduced the bill, the law was that it was kind of cloudy as to if, in the cases of child custody suits, as to where the case would be heard. Well, the purpose of the Child Custody Act is to have the trial conducted where it's in the child's best interest, regardless of the parents' interests. And that passed. And of course, I think it's nationwide now. I think it's a uniform Child Custody Act. So those are three, you know. And then there was another bill which reduced the college students' tuition by, I don't recall, a few $100s, by giving, you know, state supplements.
You mentioned the problems the Byrne administration had during its first term in legislative relationships. Did it improve after the '77 election?
Not really. I kind of think that there's something inherent with the relationship between legislators and the governor. If you go back in history to the founding of the nation, you'll find that, number one, the lower house, whether it be, of course, in those days, Congress, the lower house was the primary source of the public's reach into government. Raise taxes and spend money and provide services. The Senate is, a senior meditative, cogitative place. It's got its function, but it's basically the lower house. So that gives you one clue. The other clue is that, and that carries through into the state legislatures. The other clue is that when you see a license plate, you see a number 1 on the assembly. Of course, the Senate has copied that to some extent. They put their initials on. But the lower house is number 1. And they want you to know, they want the governor to know that they are number 1. Not the governor, not the Senate. They are number 1. I kind of think that's part of it.
Okay. I wanted you to give some just brief take on a few of the big issues that still have impact today that sort of generated in the 70s. Just were they successes or failures? The Meadowlands and the sports complex.
I have mixed feelings about the Meadowlands. I've always thought that that area should have been kept open space. That should have been open space. And I think that was I'm at fault as well as the next guy in the fact that it's not. And sometimes you have to bow to public pressure. And I think that's what happened. Of course, there are a lot of issues beyond the fact that the Meadowlands has been developed. There's the issue of the dumping. And that, of course, is one of the reasons I felt that that should be kept in open space, and maybe not as a dumping ground. All right? But, of course, I don't know where else to put the stuff. You run out of space. You can't keep putting it into Pennsylvania. You can't keep putting it into upstate New York. I mean, where do you put it? But then, of course, you got the political, the sleazy part of it, where the contractors and the lawyers and whoever gets into the act. And, of course, that's messed it up considerably. And the public's going to pay a high price for that.
How about Atlantic City and casinos?
I was against. My closest buddy in the legislature was Chuck Worthington. Mm-hmm. He and I were like brothers. And as you know, he was one of the sponsors. And I was against it up until the last moment. And I figured, look, even though it's not my cup of tea, you have to make some trade-offs. And I said, well, Chuck is my friend. I got to help him. So I voted for it, but I don't like gambling.
And looking back, do you think it's, despite the jobs and the investment, been a failure?
Well, of course, I haven't been down to Atlantic City in, must be 10, 12 years, maybe more. It might be 20 years. And so I know it's developed. How it's developed, I'd like to see. I haven't seen that. But there's just, it's wrong to go in the direction of raising money from people who shouldn't be gambling. It's the wrong way to go. And part of that problem is that the public is at fault because they want to gamble. They would rather gamble than to pay taxes. I mean, that's the bottom line.
How about the Pinelands?
The Pinelands? Well, Brendan, of course, helped to save a lot of the Pinelands. He deserves the credit,
But overall, do you think the Pinelands has been successful?
Well, I don't know because I haven't been down there recently either. And I know that there's been some development. What it's like, I don't know. But look, what you'd like to see and what you're going to see are two different things.
And I guess most significantly, after all these years, how do you see the success or failure of the school reform and state financing programs that started in the 70s and obviously have been tinkered with several times since you left the legislature?
I'd like to think that we made some progress. Of course, we did make some progress by putting more money in. It's got to have some impact. I'm not prepared to give you any figures. I don't know the figures. I don't know how many benefits there have been. I know that we still have buildings that have to be replaced. I know that we have bathrooms that don't work. I mean, you read about it in the papers. My own feeling is that it's not money alone. I buy that argument. How you cope with it is another matter. I went to a high school, as I told you earlier, where we had 5,000 students. And I think I got as good an education, maybe better, than some of the kids that are going to high schools where they may have 1,200 students or 800. I think it's based upon the quality of the teachers and the willingness, the desire for learning on the part of the students. If you don't have that, I don't think you have anything. You know, yeah, sure. Some kids need their bellies full before they go to school. No question about that. And there are a lot of them. And now we're in a recession, which may turn into a depression. And every day you read about the homeless and the kids who are losing their homes. I mean, that's got to have an impact psychologically, let alone their stomachs. And so it's a situation that's almost a vicious cycle.
Going back to sort of wrap up your assembly career, how do you see the political situation in your district as you complete your third term?
I would like to see a change. I think 30 years in the legislature is far too much. Far too much. In the first place, I don't agree with him, Jerry Cardinale. Never have. He's at the opposite side of the spectrum. The other legislator, whose name I forget at the moment, I think it's time for a change, which was my theme song in 1964, and the papers made a big deal of that, like it was something new had been discovered, time for a change. At any rate, I think it's time for a change. I think that Cardinale, 30 years is too much. You know, all he's doing is building up a pension which he probably doesn't need. And I'd like to see a couple of Democrats. You know, the big problem is finding good people to run. In Cresskill, we used to have a viable Democratic Party. We don't have a Democratic Party today. We haven't had for many years. People just are not coming forward. And you can't find people. You try to get somebody, and oh no, I don't want to run. I don't want to run.
What do you attribute that to? Toward a general negativity toward politics?
Well, there's several, yes. That's one thing. The other thing, people have to make a living. And our town has very wealthy people who live in McMansions, who, in their spare time, they travel or watch television or whatever. And so they don't want to be bothered. You know, politics takes a lot of time. I don't have to tell you that.
What about the so-called reforms in ethics and financial disclosure? Has that kept some people out of the race who might be quality candidates?
Yeah, possibly. I don't know whether you can put the cart before the horse. You know, you talk about reforms. We passed the public financing, reporting, and all of that. I think a lot of these reports go into a dead file, someplace in Trenton or outside of Trenton. I don't know how many people, maybe some students here look at them. Maybe your opponent in an election may look at it. But I don't think people delve into that. I delved into it because I was interested. But I don't know how many other legislators look at them. And, you know, as far as reforms are concerned, you look at Congress. If Congress can't reform itself, how do you expect the state of New Jersey to reform itself?
Harold, in your post-assembly career, do you want to talk about some of your special interests, both in the charities and nonprofits and others? Yeah,
we contribute. I'm not a pauper, as you know. By some standards, I'm not a wealthy man. I'm not in Madoff's category, and maybe maybe that's great. At any rate, we contribute substantially to Rutgers, as you know. We contribute to hospitals, and we've got some good hospitals that we contribute to. And we contribute to a whole raft of what we consider worthy endeavors. But as far as my activity is concerned, my wife drags me out of bed and gets me to go to exercise every day, which is good, because otherwise I think I'd vegetate or read the paper all the 20 hours a day. And I don't do a heck of a lot outside of exercise and read the papers or books or whatever.
How about any family news or?
Oh yeah, well, our family is increasing. As a matter of fact, while I'm talking to you here, we may become grandparents for the 8th time.
Congratulations.
So that's something that intrigues us. It may not intrigue us when we have to get down on the floor to play with him. If we can get up again. At any rate, we got, what do we got? We got 5 boys and 2 girls, and we're expecting another boy, or so we're told.
Before we close, any final thoughts on New Jersey, government, politics, governors you've known?
Well, I'd like to see it more effective. I don't know how it can be. I wish I had the answer to that. I'd like to see a higher degree of ethics. You know, reading the papers sometimes can be misleading. For example, Wayne Bryant, I don't know him, I never met him. He was convicted, you know the story. Everybody knows the story. It's kind of a two-edged sword. I think that he meant well, tried to bring money into areas that needed money. Certainly Rutgers needs money, Camden needs money, Newark needs money, the hospitals need money. You know, it's a question of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. He may have crossed the line. I'm not prepared to say that. I'm not a lawyer and I don't know all the ramifications of his case or any of the sort. And I'm not saying he should be absolved. I'm not saying that. But the thing that comes across to the public and to me as a reader is that, it's crooked. It's crooked politics. That may not be true. There's a possibility it may not be true. But who's going to look at the fine print? And who's going to make that decision?
Reba, did we forget anything?
She'll tell me that I spoke too long, which is probably true.
I doubt that, but thank you.
You're welcome.